Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know, by P.W. Singer and Alan Friedman. Narrated by Sean Pratt. Introduction. Why write a book about cybersecurity and cyber war? All this cyber stuff. The setting was a Washington, D.C. conference room. The speaker was a senior leader of the U.S. Department of Defense. The topic was why he thought cybersecurity and cyber war was so important. And yet, when he could only describe the problem as all this cyber stuff, he unintentionally convinced us to write this book. Both of us are in our 30s and yet still remember the first computers we used. For a 5-year-old Alan, it was an early Apple Macintosh in his home in Pittsburgh. Its disk space was so limited that it could not even fit this book into its memory. For a 7-year-old Peter, it was a Commodore on display at a science museum in North Carolina. He took a class on how to program, learning an entire new language for the sole purpose of making one of the most important inventions in the history of mankind print out a smiley face. It spun out of a spool printer, replete with the perforated paper strips on the side. 3 decades later, the centrality of computers to our lives is almost impossible to comprehend. Indeed, we are so surrounded by computers that we don't even think of them as computers anymore. We are woken by computerized clocks, take showers in water heated by a computer, drink coffee brewed in a computer, eat oatmeal heated up in a computer, then drive to work in a car controlled by hundreds of computers, while sneaking peeks at the last night's sports scores on a computer. And then at work, we spend most of our day pushing buttons on a computer, an experience so futuristic in our parents' day that it was the stuff of the Jetsons. George Jetson's job was a digital index operator. Yet perhaps the best way to gain even a hint of computers' modern ubiquity is at the end of the day. Lie in bed, turn off the lights, and count the number of little red lights staring back at you. These machines are not just omnipresent, they are connected. The computers we used as little kids stood alone, linked to nothing more than the wall electricity socket and maybe that spool printer. Just a generation ago, the Internet was little more than a link between a few university researchers. The first electronic mail was sent in 1971. The children of those scientists now live in a world where almost 40 trillion emails are sent a year. The first website was made in 1991. By 2013, there were over 30 trillion individual web pages. Moreover, the Internet is no longer just about sending mail or compiling information. It now also handles everything from linking electrical plants to tracking purchases of Barbie dolls. Indeed, Cisco, the company that helps run much of the back end of the Internet, estimated that 8.7 billion devices were connected to the Internet by the end of 2012. A figure it believes will rise to 40 billion by 2020, as cars, fridges, medical devices, and gadgets not yet imagined or invented all link in. In short, domains that range from commerce to communication to the critical infrastructure that powers our modern-day civilization all operate on what has become a globalized network of networks. But with the rise of all this cyber stuff, this immensely important but incredibly short history of computers and the Internet has reached a defining point. Just as the upside of the cyber domain is rippling out into the physical domain, with rapid and often unexpected consequences, so too is the downside. As we will explore, the astounding numbers behind all this cyber stuff drive home the scale and range of the threats. 97% of Fortune 500 companies have been hacked, and 3% likely have been too and just don't know it. And more than 100 governments are gearing up to fight battles in the online domain. Alternatively, the problems can be conceptualized through the tough political issues that this stuff has already produced. For example, scandals like WikiLeaks and NSA monitoring, new cyber weapons like Stuxnet, and the role that social networking plays in everything, from the Arab Spring revolutions to your own concerns over personal privacy. Indeed, President Barack Obama declared that cybersecurity risks pose some of the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century, a position that has been repeated by leaders in countries from Britain to China. For all the hope and promise of the information age, ours is also a time of cyber anxiety. In a survey of where the world was heading in the future, Foreign Policy magazine described the cyber area as the single greatest emerging threat, while the Boston Globe claimed that future is already here, stating, "A cyber world war in progress will culminate in bloody digital trench warfare." These fears have coalesced into the massive booming business of cybersecurity, one of the fastest-growing industries in the world. It has led to the creation of various new governmental offices and bureaucracies. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security's National Cybersecurity Division has doubled or tripled in size every year since its inception. The same is true for armed forces around the globe, like the U.S. Cyber Command and the Chinese Information Security Base, new military units whose very mission is to fight and win wars in cyberspace. As we later consider, these aspects of cyber stuff raise very real risks, but how we perceive and respond to these risks may be even more crucial to the future, and not just of the Internet. As Joe Nye, the former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, notes, if users begin to lose confidence in the safety and security of the Internet, they will retreat from cyberspace, trading welfare in search of security. Fears over cybersecurity increasingly compromise our notions of privacy and have allowed surveillance and Internet filtering to become more common and accepted at work, at home, and at the governmental level. Entire nations, too, are pulling back, which will undermine the economic and human rights benefits we've seen from global connectivity. China is already developing its own network of companies behind a great firewall to allow it to screen incoming messages and disconnect from the worldwide Internet if needed. As a Yale Law School article put it, all of these trends are converging into a perfect storm that threatens traditional Internet values of openness, collaboration, innovation, limited government, and free exchange of ideas. These issues will have consequences well beyond the Internet. There is a growing sense of vulnerability in the physical world from new vectors of cyber attack via the virtual world. As a report entitled "The New Cyber Arms Race" describes, in the future, wars will not just be fought by soldiers with guns or with planes that drop bombs. They will also be fought with the click of a mouse a half a world away that unleashes carefully weaponized computer programs that disrupt or destroy critical industries like utilities, transportation, communications, and energy. Such attacks could also disable military networks that control the movement of troops, the path of jet fighters, the command and control of warships. Such a vision of costless war or instant defeat either scares or comforts, wholly dependent on which side of the cyber attack you're on. The reality, as we explore later in the book, is much more complex. Such visions don't just stoke fears and drive budgets. They also are potentially leading to the militarization of cyberspace itself. These visions threaten a domain that has delivered massive amounts of information, innovation, and prosperity to the wider planet, fueled tensions between nations, and, as the title of the aforementioned report reveals, maybe even have set in motion a new global arms race. In short, no issue has emerged so rapidly in importance as cybersecurity, and yet there is no issue so poorly understood as this cyber stuff. Why is there a cybersecurity knowledge gap, and why does it matter? Rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less and less clarity and less apparent understanding. I have sat in very small group meetings in Washington, unable, along with my colleagues, to decide on a course of action because we lack a clear picture of the long-term legal and policy implications of any decision we might make. This is how General Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA, described the cybersecurity knowledge gap and the dangers it presents. A major part of this disconnect is the consequence of those early experiences with computers, or rather the lack of them, among too many leaders. Today's youth are digital natives, having grown up in a world where computers have always existed and seem a natural feature. But the world is still mostly led by digital immigrants. Older generations for whom computers and all the issues the internet age presents remain unnatural and often confusing. To put it another way, few older than 50 will have gone through their university training even using a computer. Even the few who did likely used one that stood alone, not connected to the world. Our most senior leaders, now in their 60s and 70s, likely did not even become familiar with computers until well into their careers, and many, still today, have only the most limited experience with them. As late as 2001, the director of the FBI did not have a computer in his office, while the U.S. Secretary of Defense would have his assistant print out emails to him, write his response in pen, and then have the assistant type them back in. This sounds outlandish, except that a full decade later, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in charge of protecting the nation from cyber threats, told us at a 2012 conference, "Don't laugh, but I just don't use email at all." It wasn't a fear of security, but that she just didn't believe email useful. And in 2013, Justice Elena Kagan revealed the same was true of 8 out of 9 of the United States Supreme Court justices, the very people who would ultimately decide what was legal or not in this space. It is not solely an issue of age. If it was, we could just wait until the old farts died off and all would be solved. Just because someone is young doesn't mean the person automatically has an understanding of the key issues. Cybersecurity is one of those areas that has been left to only the most technically inclined to worry their uncombed heads over. Anything related to the digital world of zeros and ones was an issue just for computer scientists and the IT help desk. Whenever they spoke, most of us would just keep quiet, nod our heads, and put on what author Mark Bowden calls the glaze. This is the unmistakable look of profound confusion and disinterest that takes hold whenever conversation turns to workings of a computer. The glaze is the face you put on when you can only call something stuff. Similarly, those who are technically inclined too often roll their eyes at the foreign logic of the policy and business worlds, scoffing at the old way of doing business without understanding the interactions between technology and people. The result is that cybersecurity falls into a no-man's land. The field is becoming crucial to areas as intimate as your privacy and as weighty as the future of world politics. But it's a domain only well known by the IT crowd. It touches every major area of public and private sector concern, but only the young and the computer savvy are well engaged with it. In turn, the technical community that understands the workings too often sees the world only through a specific lens and can fail to appreciate the broader picture or non-technical aspects. Critical issues are thus left misunderstood and often undebated. The dangers are diverse and drove us in the writing of the book. Each of us, in whatever role we play in life, must make decisions about cybersecurity that will shape the future well beyond the world of computers. But often we do so without the proper tools. Basic terms and essential concepts that define what is possible and proper are being missed, or even worse, distorted. Past myth and future hype often weave together, obscuring what actually happened and where we really are now. Some threats are overblown and overreacted to, while others are ignored. This gap has wide implications. One U.S. general described to us how understanding cyber is now a command responsibility, as it affects almost every part of modern war. And yet, as another general put it pointedly, there is a real dearth of doctrine and policy in the world of cyberspace. His concern, as we explore later, was not just that the military side needed to do a better job at cyber calculus, but that the civilian side was not providing any coordination or guidance. Some likened today to the time before World War I, when the militaries of Europe planned to utilize new technologies, like railroads. The problem was that they, and the civilian leaders and publics behind them, didn't understand the technologies or their implications, and so made uninformed decisions that inadvertently, drove their nations into war. Others draw parallels to the early years of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons and the political dynamics they drove weren't well understood, and even worse, were largely left to specialists. The result was that notions we now laugh off as Dr. Strangelovian were actually taken seriously, nearly leaving the planet a radioactive hulk. International relations are already becoming poisoned by this disconnect between what is understood and what is known. While we are both Americans, and thus many of the examples and lessons in this book reflect that background, the cyber stuff problem is not just an American concern. We were told the same by officials and experts from places ranging from China and Abu Dhabi to Britain and France. In just one illustration of the global gap, the official assigned to be the czar for cybersecurity in Australia had never even heard of Tor, a critical technology to the field and its future. Don't worry, you, and hopefully she, will learn what everyone needs to know about Tor in Part 2 of our book. This is worrisome not just because of the naivete of such public officials, but because it is actually beginning to have a dangerous impact on global order. For instance, there is perhaps no other relationship as important to the future of global stability as that between the two great powers of the United States and China. Yet, as senior policymakers and general publics on both sides struggle to understand the cyber realm's basic dynamics and implications, the issue of cybersecurity is looming ever larger in U.S.-China relations. Indeed, the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences released a report whose tone, effectively, captured how suspicion, hype, ignorance, and tension have all begun to mix together into a dangerous brew. An excerpt from the report reads, "Of late, an internet tornado has swept across the world, massively impacting and shocking the globe. Faced with this warm-up for an internet war, every nation and military can't be passive, but is making preparations to fight the internet war." This kind of language, which is mirrored in the U.S., doesn't just illustrate the brewing global cyber anxiety. It also reveals how confusion and misinformation about the basics of the issue help drive that fear. While both sides, as we explore later on, are active in both cyber offense and defense, it is the very newness of the issue that is proving so difficult. Top American and Chinese governmental leaders talked with us about how they found cybersecurity to be far more challenging than the more traditional concerns between their nations. While they may not agree on issues like trade, human rights, and regional territorial disputes, they at least understand them. Not so for cyber, where they remain woefully ill-equipped even to talk about what their own nation is doing, let alone the other side. For example, a top U.S. official involved in talks with China on cyber issues asked us what an ISP was. Here again, don't fret if you don't yet know. We'll cover this soon. If this had been back in the Cold War, that question would be akin to not knowing what an ICBM was in the midst of negotiating with the Soviets on nuclear issues. Such matters are not just issues for generals or diplomats, but also for all citizens. The general lack of understanding on this topic is becoming a democracy problem as well. As we write, there are some 50 cybersecurity bills under consideration in the U.S. Congress. Yet, the issue is perceived as too complex to matter in the end to voters, and as a result, the elected representatives who will decide the issues on their behalf. This is one of the reasons that despite all these bills, no substantive cybersecurity legislation was passed between 2002 and the writing of this book over a decade later. Again, the technology has evolved so quickly that it is no surprise that most voters and their elected leaders are little engaged on cybersecurity concerns. But they should be. This field connects areas that range from the security of your bank accounts and online identity to broader issues of who and which governments can access your personal secrets, and even when and where your nation goes to war. We are all users of this realm, and are all shaped by it. Yet we are not having any kind of decent public dialogue on it. We're not having a really good informed debate, as one professor at the U.S. National Defense University put it. Instead, we either punt the problem down the road for others to figure out, or to the small number of people who make important policy in the smoky back rooms. And even that is insufficient, given that most people in today's smoky back rooms have never been in an internet chat room. How did you write the book, and what do you hope to accomplish? With all of these issues at play, the timing and value of a book that tried to tackle the basic issues that everyone should know about cybersecurity and cyber war seemed ideal. And the format of this Oxford series, where all the books are in a question and answer style, seemed to hit that sweet spot. As we set out to research and write the book, this question and answer style then structured our methodology. To put it another way, if you are locked into a Q&A format, you better first decide the right set of cues. We tried to gather all the key questions that people had about this field, not only those asked by people working in politics or technology, but also from our interactions and interviews well beyond. This set of questions was backed by what would have previously been called a literature survey. In the old pre-internet days, this meant going to the library and pulling off the shelf all the books in that section of the Dewey Decimal System. Today, on this topic especially, the sources range from books to online journals to microblogs. We were also greatly aided by a series of workshops and seminars at Brookings, the think tank in Washington we work at. These gathered key public and private sector experts to explore questions ranging from the efficiency of cyber deterrence to what can be done about botnets, all questions later dealt with in the book. We also held a series of meetings and interviews with key American officials and experts. They ranged from top folks like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer, and the director of the National Security Agency, down to low-ranking systems administrators, from civilian governors, cabinet secretaries and CEOs, to small business owners and teenaged hackers. Our scope was global, and so the meetings also included leaders and experts from China, the foreign minister, and generals from the PLA among them, as well as the UK, Canada, Germany, France, Australia, Estonia, United Arab Emirates, and Singapore. Finally, while it is a virtual world, we also visited key facilities and various cybersecurity hubs in locales that ranged from the DC Beltway and Silicon Valley to Paris and Abu Dhabi. Over the course of this journey, we noticed a pattern. The questions and the issues that came from them generally fell under three categories. The first were questions of the essential contours and dynamics of cyberspace and cybersecurity, the "how does it all work" questions. Think of these as the driver's ed part, which gives the basic building blocks to the online world. The second were questions on the broader implications of cybersecurity beyond cyberspace, the "why does it matter" questions. And then there were questions on the potential responses, the "what can we do" questions. The following sections follow this basic structure. And with the questions laid out, then came the task of answering them. This book is the result. While the questions are diverse, you'll notice that over the course of answering them, a few themes emerged to run through the book. They are: 1. Knowledge matters. It is vital we demystify this realm if we ever want to get anything effective done in securing it. 2. People matter. Cybersecurity is one of those wicked problem areas that's rife with complexities and trade-offs. This is in large part not because of the technical side, but because of the people part. The people behind the machines are inherently inside any problem or needed solution. 3. Incentives matter. If you want to understand why something is or isn't happening in cyberspace, look to the motivations, the costs, and the tensions at play behind the issue. Indeed, anyone claiming a simple silver bullet solution in the cyber realm is either ignorant or up to no good. 4. The crowd matters. This is not a realm where governments can or should have all the answers. Cybersecurity depends on all of us. 5. States matter. That said, governments' roles are crucial, especially the United States and China. The reason is not just that these two nations remain powerful and influential, but that the interplay of their often differing visions of cybersecurity are critical to the future of both the Internet and world politics. And finally, 6. Cats matter. In the end, the Internet is what we make of it. And that means while serious stuff is at play in it, cyberspace is also a fun, often whimsical realm, with memes like dancing babies and keyboard-playing cats. So, any treatment of it should be sure to capture that whimsy. To put it another way, our goal was to wrestle directly with the cyber stuff problem that set us on the journey. This is a book written by 2 researchers, following rigorous academic guidelines, and published by an esteemed university press. But our intent was not a book only for academics. The best research in the world is worthless if it doesn't find its way into the hands of those who need it. Indeed, the number of academic papers related to cybersecurity has increased at a compound annual growth rate of 20% for well over a decade. Yet no one would say that the broader world is all the more informed. Instead, we embraced this series' core idea of what everyone needs to know. Everyone does not need to know the software programming secrets of Stuxnet or the legal dynamics of ISP insurance schemes. But as we all become more engaged in and dependent on cybersecurity, there are certain building blocks of understanding that we all need to have. Ignorance is not bliss when it comes to cybersecurity. Cyber issues affect literally everyone. Politicians wrestling with everything from cybercrime to online freedom. Generals protecting the nation from new forms of attack while planning new cyber wars. Business executives defending firms from once unimaginable threats and looking to make money off of them. Lawyers and ethicists building new frameworks for right and wrong. Most of all, cybersecurity issues affect us as individuals. We face new questions in everything from our rights and responsibilities as citizens of both the online and real world to how to protect ourselves and our families from a new type of danger. So this is not a book only for experts, but rather a book intended to unlock the field, to raise the general level of expertise, and then push the discussion forward. We hope that you find the journey useful, and ideally, even enjoyable, just like the world of cyber stuff itself. Peter Warren Singer and Alan A. Friedman, August 2013, Washington, D.C. Part 1. How it works. The World Wide What? Defining cyberspace. It's not a truck. It's a series of tubes. This is how the late Alaska Senator Ted Stevens famously explained cyberspace during a congressional hearing in 2006. As late-night humorist Jon Stewart noted, that someone who doesn't seem to know jack bleep about computers or the Internet is just the guy in charge of regulating it, is a near-perfect illustration of how disconnected Washington policymakers can be from technological reality. While it's easy to mock the elderly senator's notion of electronic letters shooting through tubes, the reality is that defining ideas and terms in cyber issues can be difficult. Stevens's tubes is actually a mangling of the idea of pipes, an analogy that is used by experts in the field to describe data connections. If he wanted to be perfectly accurate, Stevens could have used science fiction writer William Gibson's original conception of cyberspace. Gibson first used the word, an amalgam of cybernetics and space, in a 1982 short story. He defined it 2 years later in his genre-revolutionizing novel titled Neuromancer as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, a graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data. Of course, if the senator had described cyberspace that way, most people would have thought him stoned rather than simply disconnected. Part of why cyberspace is so difficult to define lies not only in its expansive global nature, but also in the fact that the cyberspace of today is almost unrecognizable compared to its humble beginnings. The U.S. Department of Defense can be considered the godfather of cyberspace, dating back to its funding of early computing and original networks like ARPANET. More on this soon. Yet even the Pentagon has struggled to keep pace as its baby has grown up. Over the years, it has issued at least 12 different definitions of what it thinks of as cyberspace. These range from the notional environment in which digitized information is communicated over computer networks, which was rejected because it implied cyberspace was only for communication and largely imaginary, to a domain characterized by the use of electronics and the electromagnetic spectrum, which was also rejected, as it encompassed everything from computers and missiles to the light from the sun. In its latest attempt in 2008, the Pentagon assembled a team of experts who took over a year to agree on yet another definition of cyberspace. This time they termed it the global domain within the information environment, consisting of the interdependent network of information technology infrastructures, including the Internet, communications networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers. It is certainly a more detailed definition, but so dense that one almost wishes we could go back to just the tubes. For the purposes of this book, we think it's best to keep it simple. At its essence, cyberspace is the realm of computer networks and the users behind them, in which information is stored, shared, and communicated online. But rather than trying to find the exact perfectly worded definition of cyberspace, it is more useful to unpack what these definitions are trying to get at. What are the essential features that not only compose cyberspace, but also make it unique? Cyberspace is, first and foremost, an information environment. It's made up of digitized data that is created, stored, and most importantly, shared. This means that it's not merely a physical place and thus defies measurement in any kind of physical dimension. But cyberspace isn't purely virtual. It comprises the computers that store data, plus the systems and infrastructure that allow it to flow. This includes the Internet of networked computers, closed intranets, cellular technologies, fiber optic cables, and space-based communications. While we often use Internet as shorthand for the digital world, cyberspace has also come to encompass the people behind those computers and how their connectivity has altered their society. One of the key features, then, of cyberspace is that its systems and technologies are man-made. As such, cyberspace is defined as much by the cognitive realm as by the physical or digital. Perceptions matter, and they inform cyberspace's internal structures in everything, from how the names within cyberspace are assigned, to who owns which parts of the infrastructure that powers and uses it. This leads to an important point, often misunderstood. Cyberspace may be global, but it is not stateless or a global commons, both terms frequently used in government and media. Just as we humans have artificially divided our globe into territories that we call nations, and in turn, our human species into various groups like nationalities, the same can be done with cyberspace. It relies on physical infrastructure and human users who are tied to geography, and thus is also subject to our human notions like sovereignty, nationality, and property. Or, to put it another way, cyberspace's divisions are as real as the meaningful, but also imaginary, lines that divide the United States from Canada, or North from South Carolina. But cyberspace, like life, is constantly evolving. The hybrid combination of technology and the humans that use it is always changing, inexorably altering everything from cyberspace's size and scale to the technical and political rules that seek to guide it. As one expert put it, the geography of cyberspace is much more mutable than other environments. Mountains and oceans are hard to move, but portions of cyberspace can be turned on and off with the click of a switch. The essential features remain the same, but the topography is in constant flux. The cyberspace of today is both the same as, but also utterly different from, the cyberspace of 1982. The hardware and software that make up cyberspace, for instance, were originally designed for computers operating from fixed wires and telephone lines. Mobile devices were first the stuff of Star Trek, and then only for the drug dealers on Miami Vice who could afford to have something as exotic as a car phone. Today, a growing percentage of computing is moving onto mobile devices, so much so that we've seen toddlers punch the screens of desktop computers as if they were broken iPads. Along with the technology of cyberspace, our expectations of it are likewise evolving. This generates new norms of behavior, from how kids play to the even more powerful concept that we should all have access to cyberspace and be able to express our personal opinions within it, on everything from a Hollywood star's new hairdo to what we think of an authoritarian leader. So what constitutes the Internet itself is evolving before us in an even more fundamental way. It is simultaneously becoming massively bigger. Each day some 2.5 to the 17th power bytes are added to the global supply of digital information, and far more personalized. Rather than passively receiving this onslaught of online information, the individual users are creating and tailoring sites to their personal use, ultimately revealing more about themselves online. These sites range from social networks like Facebook in the United States, to Renren in China, to microblogs like Twitter and the Chinese equivalents, Tencent and Sina. Indeed, microblogs in China, called Weibo, have taken off to the extent that 550 million were registered in 2012. Thus, while cyberspace was once just a realm of communication and then e-commerce, reaching over $10 trillion a year in sales, it has expanded to include what we call critical infrastructure. These are the underlying sectors that run our modern-day civilization, ranging from agriculture and food distribution to banking, healthcare, transportation, water, and power. Each of these once stood apart but are now all bound together and linked into cyberspace via information technology, often through what are known as supervisory, control, and data acquisitions, or by its acronym, SCADA, or SCADA systems. These are the computer systems that monitor, adjust switching, and control other processes of critical infrastructure. Notably, the private sector controls roughly 90% of U.S. critical infrastructure, and the firms behind it use cyberspace to, among other things, balance the levels of chlorination in your city's water, control the flow of gas that heats your home, and execute the financial transactions that keep currency prices stable. Cyberspace is thus evolving from the nervous system and control system of our economy, as President George W. Bush once said, into something more. As Wired magazine editor Ben Hammersley describes, cyberspace is becoming the dominant platform for life in the 21st century. We can bitch about it, but Facebook, Twitter, Google, and all the rest are, in many ways, the very definition of modern life in the democratic West. For many, a functioning Internet with freedom of speech and a good connection to the social networks of our choice is a sign not just of modernity, but of civilization itself. This is not because people are addicted to the video screen or have some other patronizing psychological diagnosis, but because the Internet is where we live. It's where we do business, where we meet, where we fall in love. It is the central platform for business, culture, and personal relationships. There's not much else left. To misunderstand the centrality of these services to today's society is to make a fundamental error. The Internet isn't a luxury addition to life. For most people, knowingly or not, it is life. But just as in life, not everyone plays nice. The Internet that we've all grown to love and now need is increasingly becoming a place of risk and danger. Where did this cyber stuff come from anyway? A short history of the Internet. Low. This was the very first real word transmitted over the computer network that would evolve into the Internet. But rather than the beginning of some profound proclamation like, "Lo and behold," low was instead the product of a system failure. In 1969, researchers at UCLA were trying to log into a computer at the Stanford Research Institute. But before they could type the G in the word log, the computer at the Stanford end of the network crashed. However, the ARPANET project, so named as it was funded by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, would eventually transform how computers share data, and with that, everything else. Electronic communication networks have been shaping how we share information since the invention of the telegraph, the device that some now look back on and call the Victorian Internet. The hype around that old technology were similarly high. Contemporaries declared that with the telegraph, it is impossible that old prejudices and hostilities should longer exist. What makes the Internet distinct from prior communication networks, like the old telegraphs and then telephone networks, however, is that it is packet-switched instead of circuit-switched. Packets are small digital envelopes of data. At the beginning of each packet, essentially the outside of the envelope, is the header, which contains details about the network's source, destination, and some basic information about the packet contents. By breaking up flows of data into smaller components, each can be delivered in an independent and decentralized fashion, then reassembled at the endpoint. The network routes each packet as it arrives, a dynamic architecture that creates both flexibility and resiliency. Packet switching was not developed to allow the United States to maintain communications even in the event of a nuclear attack, a common myth. It was really just developed to better enable more reliable, more efficient connections between computers. Prior to its rise in the 1970s, communication between two computers required a dedicated circuit, or preassigned bandwidth. This direct link meant those resources could not be used by anyone else, even when no data was being transmitted. By breaking these conversations into smaller parts, packets from multiple distinct conversations could share the same network links. It also meant that if one of the network links between two machines went down mid-communication, a transmission could be automatically rerouted with no apparent loss of connection, since there was never a connection to begin with. ARPA, now known as DARPA with a D for the word defense added, was an organization developed by the Pentagon to avoid technological surprise by leaping ahead in research. Computers were proliferating in the late 1960s, but even more researchers wanted to use them than was available. To ARPA, that meant finding ways to allow people at different institutions to take advantage of unused computer time around the country. Rather than have dedicated and expensive connections between universities, the vision was a network of shared data links, sharing computational resources. Individual machines would each be connected with an interface message processor that handled the actual network connection. This network was ARPANET, home of the first LOW and start of the modern cyber era. That first 1969 link from UCLA to Stanford grew to link 40 nodes in 1972. Soon, more universities and research centers around the world joined this first network, or, alternatively, created their own networks. For the purpose of the modern Internet, a series of packets sent between machines on a single network does not count as an Internet. Internet implies connecting many different networks, in this case these various other computer networks beyond ARPANET that soon emerged but remained unlinked. The challenge was that different networks used very different underlying technology. The technical problem boiled down to abstracting these differences and allowing efficient communication. In 1973, the solution was found. Vint Cerf, then a professor at Stanford, and Robert Kahn of ARPA, refined the idea of a common transmission protocol. This protocol established the expectations that each end of the communication link should make of the other. It began with the computer equivalent of a three-way handshake to establish a connection, continuing through how each party should break apart the messages to be reassembled and how to control transmission speeds to automatically detect bandwidth availability. The brilliance of the model is how it breaks the communication into layers and allows each layer to function independently. These packets, in turn, can be sent over any type of network, from sound waves to radio waves to light pulses on a glass fiber. Such transport control protocols, or TCPs, could be used over all sorts of packet protocols, but we now use a type called the Internet Protocol, or IP, almost exclusively in the modern Internet. This protocol enabled the creation of a network of networks. But of course, the Internet didn't stop there. The new links excelled at connecting machines, but humans excel at making technology conform to their whims. As people shared machines for research, they started leaving messages for each other. Simple files that could be edited to form a conversation. This became clunky, and in 1972, Ray Tomlinson at the technical consulting firm BBN wrote a basic program to read, compose, and send messages. This was email, the first Internet killer app. Within a year, a majority of traffic across the network originally created for research was email. Now, networked communication was about people. The last step in creating the modern Internet was eliminating barriers to entry. Early use was limited to those who had access to the networked computers at research and defense institutions. These organizations communicated via dedicated data lines. As the evident value of networked communication grew and the price of computers dropped, more organizations sought to join. Modems, which convert data to sound waves and back, allowed basic phone lines to serve as links to other computers. Soon, researchers outside computer science wanted access, not just to take advantage of the shared computing resources, but also to study the new networking technology itself. The U.S. National Science Foundation then connected the existing supercomputing centers around the country into the NSF net, which grew so rapidly that the expansion required commercial management. Each upgrade brought greater demand, the need for more capacity, and independently organized infrastructure. The architecture of a backbone that managed traffic between the different regional networks emerged as the efficient solution. This period also saw the introduction of the profit motive in Internet expansion. For instance, by this point, Vint Cerf had joined the telecommunications firm MCI. In 1983, he led efforts to start MCI Mail, the first commercial email service on the Internet. By the late 1980s, it became obvious that managing the nascent Internet was not the business of the research community. Commercial actors could provide the necessary network services supporting the Internet and become avid consumers as well. So, the White House Office of Science and Technology developed a plan to expand and commercialize the backbone services, seeing it as the only way that the new Internet could truly take off. The planners envisioned a decade-long process, though, with the final stages of commercial handover not completed until the late 1990s. Fortunately, a young senator from Tennessee became convinced it should speed up. In 1989, Al Gore authored a bill calling for quicker privatization of the network. While he would later make a slight overstatement that he took the initiative in creating the Internet, this move by Congress to accelerate things was crucially important to the Internet's expansion. By the time Gore was vice president in 1994, the NSF was turning over official control of regional backbone connections to private interests. This privatization coincided with various new inventions and improvements that then democratized and popularized the Internet. In 1990, a researcher at the European Research Center CERN in Switzerland took a relatively obscure form of presenting information in a set of linked computer documents and built a new networking interface for it. With this Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, and an accompanying system to identify the linked documents, known as URLs, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web as we now look at it. Amusingly, when Berners-Lee tried to present it at an academic conference, his breakthrough wasn't considered worthy enough even to make a formal panel. Instead, he was relegated to showing a poster on it in a hallway. A few years later, researchers at the University of Illinois introduced the Mosaic web browser, which simplified both web design and introduced the new practice of web surfing for the general public. And whether we like to admit it or not, This is the period when the pornography industry proved integral to the Internet's history. A darker domain that some estimate makes up 25% of all Internet searches, the smut industry drove both new online users and new online uses, like instant messaging, chat rooms, online purchasing, streaming video, trading files, and webcams, and the growing demands each of these placed on bandwidth, driving more underlying business. Of course, pornography has played a key role in the web, says Paul Sappho, an analyst with the Institute for the Future, a Silicon Valley think tank. Porn is to new media formats what acne is to teenagers, he said. It's just part of the process of growing up. And soon the mainstream media started to wake up to the fact that something big was happening online. As the New York Times reported in 1994, in a printed newspaper, of course, increasing commercialization of the Internet will accelerate its transformation away from an esoteric communication system for American computer scientists and into an international system for the flow of data, text, graphics, sound, and video among businesses, their customers, and their suppliers. Lo and behold, indeed. How does the Internet actually work? For a few hours in February 2008, Pakistan held hostage all the world's cute cat videos. The situation came about when the Pakistani government, in an attempt to prevent its own citizens from accessing what it decided was offensive content, ordered Pakistan Telecom to block access to the video sharing website YouTube. To do so, Pakistan Telecom falsely informed its customers' computers that the most direct route to YouTube was through Pakistan Telecom, and then prevented Pakistani users from reaching the genuine YouTube site. Unfortunately, the company's network shared this false claim of identity beyond its own network, and the false news of the most direct way to YouTube spread across the Internet's underlying mechanisms. Soon, over 2/3 of all the world's Internet users were being misdirected to the fake YouTube location, which, in turn, overwhelmed Pakistani Telecom's own network. The effects were temporary, but the incident underscores the importance of knowing how the Internet works. The best way to gain this understanding is to walk through how information gets from one place to another in the virtual world. It's a bit complex, but we'll do our best to make it easy. Suppose you wanted to visit the informative and, dare we say, entertaining website of the Brookings Institution, the think tank where we work. In essence, you have asked your device to talk to a computer controlled by Brookings in Washington, D.C. Your machine must learn where that computer is and establish a connection to enable communication. The first thing your computer needs to know is how to find the servers that host the Brookings web page. To do that, it will use the Internet Protocol, or IP number, that serves as the address for endpoints on the Internet. Your machine was most likely automatically assigned an IP address by your Internet service provider or whatever network you are using. It also knows the address of its router or the path to the broader Internet. Finally, your computer knows the address of a domain name system server. The domain name system, or DNS, is the protocol and infrastructure through which computers connect domain names, human memorable names like brookings.edu, to their corresponding IP addresses, machine data like 192.245.194.172. The DNS is global and decentralized. Its architecture can be thought of as a tree. The root of the tree serves as the orientation point for the domain name system. Above that are the top-level domains. These are the country codes, such as .uk, as well as other domains like .com and .net. Each of these top-level domains is then subdivided. Many countries have specific second-level domains, such as co.uk and ac.uk, to denote business and academic institutions, respectively. Entry into the club of top-level domains is controlled internationally through the Internet Corporation for assigned names and numbers, known by the acronym ICANN or ICANN, a private nonprofit organization created in 1998 to run the various Internet administration and operations tasks that had previously been performed by U.S. government organizations. Each top-level domain is run by a registry that sets its own internal policies about domains. Organizations, such as Brookings or Apple or the U.S. Department of State, acquire their domains through intermediaries called registrars. These registrars coordinate with each other to ensure the domain names at each top-level domain remain unique. In turn, each domain manages its own subdomains, such as mail.yahoo.com. To reach the Brookings domain, your computer will query the DNS system through a series of resolvers. The basic idea is to go up the levels of the tree. Starting with the root, it will be pointed to the record for .edu, which is managed by EDUCAUSE. EDUCAUSE is the organization of some 2,000 educational institutions that maintains the list of every domain registered in .edu. From this list, your computer will then learn the specific IP address of Brookings' internal name server. This will allow it to address specific queries about content or applications from inside the Brookings domain. Then, the Brookings name server will direct your computer to the specific content it is looking for by returning the IP address of the machine that hosts it. In reality, this process is a little more complex. For example, servers often store data locally in caches for future use, so that every query does not have to go to the root, and the protocol includes specific error conditions to handle errors predictably. Our rough outline, however, gives a sense of how it all works. Now that your computer has the location of the data, how will that data get to your computer? The server at Brookings needs to know that it should send data to your machine, and the data needs to get there. So now your computer requests a web page by breaking down the request into packets and sending them across the Internet. First, at the layer of the application, your browser interprets the click of your mouse as a command in the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, which defines how to ask for and deliver content. Now, this command is then passed down to the transport and network layers. The transport is responsible for breaking the data down into packet-sized chunks and making sure that all of the chunks arrive free of error and reassembled in the correct order for the application layer above. The network layer is responsible for trying its best to navigate the packets across the Internet. If you think of the data you are trying to send and receive as a package of information, the transport layer is responsible for packing and receiving the packages, while the network is responsible for moving them from source to destination. Once at the destination, the packets are reassembled, checked, and then passed back up to the application, in this case, a web server sending you the web content you requested. But how do the packets know how to get across the Internet to their destination? Like the DNS that helped your computer find the website it was looking for, the organization of Internet networks can be thought of as a hierarchy. Each computer is part of a network, like the network connecting all the customers of an Internet service provider, ISP. ISPs are essentially the organizations that provide access to the Internet, as well as other related services like email or hosting websites. Most ISPs are private, for-profit companies, including a number of the traditional telephone and cable TV firms that began offering Internet access when the field took off, while others are government or community-owned. Those networks, in turn, form nodes called Autonomous Systems, or AS, in the global Internet. Autonomous systems define the architecture of Internet connections. Traffic is routed locally through the AS and controlled by the policies of that organization. Each AS has a set of contiguous blocks of IP addresses and forms the home for these destinations. All have at least one connection to another AS, while large ISPs might have many. So, routing to a particular IP address is simply a matter of finding its AS. There's a problem, though. The Internet is big. There are over 40,000 AS nodes on the Internet today, and their interconnections are changing and shifting over time. Given this scale, a global approach to routing everything the same way is impossible. Instead, the Internet uses a dynamic, distributed system that does not maintain a permanent vision of what the network looks like at any given time. The principle of routing is fairly simple. At each point in the network, a router looks at the address of an incoming packet. If the destination is inside the network, it keeps the packet and sends it to the relevant computer. Otherwise, it consults a routing table to determine the best next step to send the packet closer to its destination. The devil is in the details of this routing table's construction. Since there is no global address book, the nodes in the network have to share key information with other routers, like which IP addresses they are responsible for and what other networks they can talk to. This process happens separately from the Internet routing process on what is known as the control plane. Routers also pass along information to their neighbors, sharing up-to-date news about the state of the network and who can talk to whom. Each router then constructs its own internal, temporary model of how best to route the traffic coming through. This new model, in turn, is shared so that a router's neighbors know how it will pass along new traffic. If this sounds complex, it's because it is. In just a few pages, we've summed up what it took decades of computer science research to create. The takeaway for cybersecurity is that the entire system is based on trust. It is a system that works efficiently, but it can be broken, either by accident or by maliciously feeding the system bad data. The Pakistani example shows what happens when that trust is abused. The government censors broke the Internet by falsely claiming to have direct access to the IP address that serves YouTube. This was a narrow, local, politically motivated announcement, but because of how the Internet works, soon every ISP in Asia was trying to route all their YouTube traffic to Pakistan, solely because they believed it was closer than the real intended destination. The models they were building were based on false information. As more networks did this, their neighbors also came to believe that YouTube was the Pakistani IP address. The whole mess wasn't resolved until Google engineers advertised the correct routes aggressively across the network. In sum, understanding the Internet's basic decentralized architecture provides two insights for cybersecurity. It offers an appreciation of how the Internet functions without top-down coordination, but it also shows the importance of the Internet's users and gatekeepers behaving properly, and how certain built-in choke points can create great vulnerabilities if they don't. Who runs it? Understanding Internet governance. In 1998, a computer researcher and a respected leader in the networking community named John Postel sent an innocuous-sounding email to 8 people. He asked them to reconfigure their servers so that they would direct their Internet traffic using his computer at the University of Southern California rather than a computer in Herndon, Virginia. They did so without question, as Postel, who had been part of the team that set up the original ARPANET, was an icon in the field, who served as a primary administrator for the network's naming system. With that one email, Postel committed the first coup d'etat of the Internet. The people he had emailed ran 8 of the 12 organizations that controlled all the name servers, the computers ultimately responsible for translating a domain name such as brookings.edu into a computer addressable IP address. And the computer in Virginia that he had steered 2/3 of the Internet's root servers away from was controlled by the U.S. government. While Postel would later say he had only seized control of a majority of the Internet's root servers as a test, others think that he did so in protest, showing the U.S. government that it couldn't wrest control of the Internet from the widespread community of researchers who had built and maintained the network over the previous 3 decades. Postel's coup illustrates the crucial role of governance issues, even for a technical space. As the Internet has grown from a small research network to the global underpinnings of our digital society, questions of who runs it have become more and more important. Or as Eric Schmidt, who went on to become the CEO of a little firm known as Google, told a 1997 programmers conference in San Francisco, "The Internet is the first thing that humanity has built that humanity doesn't understand, the largest experiment in anarchy that we have ever had." Since digital resources are not scarce like traditional resources, its governance questions are a bit different. That is, the main questions of Internet governance are of interoperability and communication, rather than the classic issue of distribution, which has consumed political thinkers from Socrates to Marx. However, even in a digital world of seemingly endless resources, traditional issues of governance also arise in cyberspace, including representation, power, and legitimacy. Key decision choke points revolve around the technical standards for interoperability, the distribution of IP numbers that gives computers an address allowing them to send and receive packets, and the management of the Internet's naming system. Interestingly enough, it is this final category, the intersection of the technical and non-technical aspects of naming, that has produced the most conflict. The operations of the Internet require independent actors to follow basic rules that guarantee interoperability, known as standards. This standards-based approach goes back to the beginning of the Internet, when the engineers building the initial systems published requests for comments, or RFCs, to seek feedback on proposed standards. Over time, this group of network engineers and researchers grew into an international, voluntary standards organization called the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF. The IETF develops new Internet standards and protocols and modifies existing ones for better performance. Everything developed by the IETF falls under specific working groups that concentrate on areas like routing, applications, and infrastructure. These groups are open forums that work mostly through mailing lists, and anyone is welcome to participate. Many of the individuals in them are from large technology firms, but no one actor or small party can steamroll the process, which relies on consensus. Openness, and even a sense of whimsy, is critical in the culture of the IETF. In some working group meetings, the members decide on an issue by humming for or against a proposal. The proposal with the loudest hum advantage wins. While it sounds a bit silly, it is seen as a way of maintaining the original Internet creator's ethic, of fostering consensus and reaching decisions relatively quickly. The volume of the humming also helps maintain a level of anonymity, unless you abuse the system. That is, you can hum or not without opening your mouth, but it's hard to hum louder to dominate a vote without being too obvious about it, which would cause backlash. Despite the sense of fun that can drive working groups' members, security is a principal concern in the system. In addition to working groups focused on particular security issues, every proposed standard must have an explicit Security Considerations section. Additionally, a security directorate reviews all proposed standards passed from the working groups to the steering group. While the IETF has no official board or formal leadership, the Internet Engineering Steering Group, or IESG, offers oversight and guidance for both the standards process and the standards themselves. In turn, the Internet Architecture Board, or IAB, which evolved from the Technical Advisory Board of the original ARPANET management in the early 1970s, offers further oversight of the IESG. Both of these organizations fall under the auspices of the Internet Society, or ISOC, an international group formed in 1992 that oversees most of the technical standards process. The ISOC came about when Internet governance moved beyond just matters of technical coordination. As the web went global and companies began to depend on Internet business, more and more participants had a financial or political stake in the system's evolution in one direction or another. Organizations began to disagree on process, and the U.S. government's central involvement worried many. The ISOC was established as an independent, international organization to offer a formal legal means to safeguard the independent and open standards processes. ISOC's power derives from its membership. It's open to any individual and, for a fee, any organization. These members then elect trustees who, in turn, appoint leadership to the IAB, which oversees the governance process for the IESG and the working groups process they guide. Imagine this alphabet soup all as a mix of informal, semi-formal, and formal groups all nested together. This structure promotes a high degree of independence while still allowing for accountability to the Internet community. While there are political and financial motivated disagreements, when it comes to standards development, the process has thus far fostered globally shared interest in maintaining a functioning Internet. This ethic of shared interest, however, becomes more difficult in dealing with property rights and other scarce resources on the Internet. The Internet may be seemingly infinite in size, but it still has zero-sum games. Identifiers such as IP addresses and domains have to be unique. The Internet won't work if multiple parties attempted to use the same IP address or wanted to resolve a domain name to a competing address. One of the earliest oversight roles was apportioning these numbers and names. What emerged was the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, a collaborative effort of the U.S. government and the early researchers who had developed the original technology. Yet as the Internet grew, control of this process grew more important. Assigning names and numbers meant control over who could access the Internet and how. John Postel's coup illustrated the need for a more transparent and accessible governance structure. The growing pressure for a commercial Internet and the emerging realization that Americans could not expect to control the network forever meant that this new structure could not be run by the U.S. government. In 1998, after a survey period that sought input from the public and key Internet leaders and organizations, responsibility shifted to an independent corporation with a governance structure that reflects the geographical and functional diversity of the Internet. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN, was born. While chartered in California as a nonprofit, ICANN set in motion a structured way to distribute IP addresses that more appropriately reflected the Internet's global nature. Regional authorities in North America, Europe, and Asia, followed later by Latin America and finally Africa in 2004, took over this task and continue to perform this role today. Not everything with ICANN is easy. Domains define identity on the Internet, which brings strong commercial and political interests into conflict. Decisions about who gets what Internet identity inherently create winners and losers. Adding new top-level domains such as .tech enables new business models, but requires more expense for trademark protection to fend off squatters. Trademarks themselves can pose risks. For example, a process was needed to decide which of the many businesses with Apple in their name could get Apple.com. At the same time, the process could not be corrupted to deny free speech opportunities, such as insert whatever trademark name you dislike, sucks.com. This process has even touched on hot issues of national identity. When nations achieve independence or dissolve into civil war, who controls their country's top-level domain? In Western Sahara, both sides of a 40-year-old conflict claim the rights to the top-level domain .eh. The process and governance of ICANN have drawn even more controversy. Policy scholars use the term multi-stakeholder process to describe its organic, open, yet non-representative approach. Decisions are supposed to be made by consensus, while a host of advisory committees help represent key constituencies in the Internet's smooth operations, such as Internet service providers and the intellectual property community. National interests from around the world are represented through a governmental advisory committee, yet this multi-stakeholder model strikes some as disposed to favor the powerful. Governments and large commercial interests can afford to pay staff to participate in these forums, while nonprofit civil society groups may lack the resources to sit at the table at all. Many argue that special interests are too heavily represented among the decision-makers. Others, want it to be more like traditional international organizations, which tend to follow the United Nations model of one state, one vote. And despite efforts to globalize Internet governance, many still see ICANN as captive to U.S. interests. The control of assigning names and numbers still ostensibly belongs to the U.S. Department of Commerce, which it delegates to ICANN by renewable contract. That is, the United States retains overall control, while the management function is held by an industry-led organization. Both have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The challenge, of course, is that no other institution or process could easily replace ICANN. While it is easy to criticize ICANN, there is no practical model for an alternative organization that must represent and balance such a broad range of interests from around the world and across all sides of complex policy issues. The key takeaway of these governance issues for cybersecurity is not just the important role that trust and open-mindedness have played in the Internet's growth, aspects that are challenged by growing security concerns, but that the Internet has always been recognized as a space that defies traditional governance models. In 1992, Internet pioneer David Clark of MIT set out his bold dictum for the community. He wrote, "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." This quote has been widely circulated. Less well known is what Clark wrote on his very next slide, which was, "What are we bad at? Growing our process to match our size." On the Internet, how do they know whether you are a dog? Identity and authentication. Carnegie Mellon University professor Alessandro Acquisti has a fun but scary party trick. Show him a picture of your face that is online, and he will then guess your social security number. Understanding how Acquisti does this is useful even for non-Americans who lack these supposedly secret social security numbers, because it illustrates the story of identity and authentication and how it can go awry. Acquisti first uses image-matching technology to find your face on a social networking website. If your birth date and birth city are listed online, as they are for most people, he then can use the patterns that link time and location to the first 5 of the 9 numbers in your social security number. Then, it's just a numbers guessing game for the remaining digits. If you come from a small state like Delaware, the social security number can be determined in less than 10 tries. In theory, no one should care, since social security numbers were never meant to be secret. Before 1972, social security cards even said, "Not for identification" on them. But as we began to use computers to track people, it became critical for computers to differentiate individuals. Using someone's name alone wasn't enough. There are too many John Smiths in the world. Across every database, each record needed to be accessed with some identifier unique to that person, and since every American had a unique social security number, it was convenient to use that. So far, so good. The number was just a means to look someone up in a computer. But this number also became the way for 2 systems to know they were talking about the same person. Soon, the social security number began to be used to track bank accounts, tax details, and all other sorts of personal information. Along the way, organizations assumed that, since social security numbers weren't published, they weren't public, and if they weren't public, they must be secret. Wrong. In the computer world, identification is the act of mapping an identity to some information about that identity. This can be as mundane as a football fantasy website, accepting the association between a person and the name the person claims, or as critical as matching a medical record to an unconscious patient. It is important to separate identification from authentication, which is the proof of the identification. This proof has traditionally been defined as something you know, something you have, or something you are. What you know is the basic password model. It's a secret that is known, presumably only by the right person. Something you have refers to a physical component with limited access, so that only the right person might have it. With bank ATMs, it's a card. while more recently the mobile phone has become a de facto authenticator for receiving text messages containing a one-time code. By entering this one-time code, people taking action on the web show that they have control of the verified mobile phone that is receiving the messages. Finally, you can prove who you are through something recognizable. Since this often refers to one's person, we call this a biometric. Biometrics can be as simple as another human recognizing your face, or as sophisticated as a sensor that recognizes your eye's retina. There are weaknesses with these proofs. Passwords can be guessed or broken and require a cognitive load, meaning you have to memorize them. And if they are reused across different contexts, then breaking one system allows an attacker into others. Things that you have can be stolen or forged, and even biometrics can be compromised. For instance, access readers that require supposedly unique fingerprints have been fooled by forged fingerprints pressed into gummy bear candy, or, much more gruesomely, pressing down an amputated finger onto the machine. Russian mobsters, ironically, don't seem to like cute bear-shaped candy. There are various mechanisms to bolster these measures. One is to contact trusted friends to confirm that individuals are who they say they are. The idea is drawn from the old line, "It's all about who you know," since a mutually trusted friend can verify that the individual in question conforms to the claimed identity. Other systems factor in the cost of fooling the controls. Anyone can create a website claiming a specific identity, but it requires time and effort to maintain an active and lengthy presence on an associated social media platform like Twitter or Facebook. Here again, these can be hacked or faked, but at a much greater cost to the attacker to pull off. After authentication is authorization. Now that a system knows who you are, what can you do? In classic computer security, authorization was about giving access to network files, but in our increasingly connected world, gaining authorization can open the doors to practically everything. Authorization is the part that links these technical issues to policy, business, political, and moral questions. Is the individual authorized to buy something, like an account on an online gambling site? And even if so, is the individual old enough to participate? Or, at a slightly larger world stage, just because someone has access to a military's classified networks, should the person be authorized to read and copy every file in them? A practice that would haunt the U.S. military in the Bradley Manning and Edwin Snowden leaks. The entire problem was perhaps best illustrated by one of the most cited cartoons in history. In 1993, New Yorker magazine published a drawing by Peter Steiner of two dogs sitting near a computer. One dog tells the other, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Yet, this isn't to say that people can't find out private details about you if they want. Every activity on the internet is data being routed from an Internet Protocol, or IP, address. As we saw in the prior section, an IP address is a numerical label that is assigned to an addressable connection in the Internet. For most consumers, the IP address is not permanently assigned to their device. Instead, the IP address will be dynamic. The consumer's internet service provider will assign an IP address for a period of time, but it might be reassigned to someone else after the consumer disconnects. However, if an internet service provider retains the relevant data, it is able to correlate the IP address to a specific date and time to a particular service subscriber. An IP address is not in and of itself information about an identifiable individual, but it can provide some information about the geographic location and the means by which that individual accesses the Internet. It is the potential for how the IP address can be combined with other information, or could be reasonably combined with other information, that has privacy advocates concerned. If you can combine enough of this online and offline information, you might have enough data to make a high probability guess about who was doing what and where. For instance, in the 2012 scandal that enveloped CIA Director General David Petraeus, the FBI was able to backtrack the anonymous sender of a series of threatening emails to the business center of a hotel that his mistress turned out to be staying at. The information gathered about identity is not the same as proof of identity. Relying on the IP address would be like relying on license plates to identify drivers. A sophisticated user can easily hide or disguise her IP address by routing her activities through another point on the Internet, making it appear that that node was responsible for the original traffic. There are, however, many other types of data that can be collected that are harder to hide. Even the patterns of how individual users browse and click through a website can be used to identify them. This question of how can we identify and authenticate online activities is a different question from how should we. You may not have wanted your social security number to be revealed at a party, or that dog might have preferred its identity remained secret, at least until the two of you had gone out on a few more online dates. For the purposes of cybersecurity, the bottom line is that digital identity is a balance between protecting and sharing information. Limiting acquired information is not only good for privacy, it can prevent others from gaining information for more sophisticated authentication fraud. At the same time, each system has incentives to maximize the amount of data it collects, as well as use that data for its own goals. What do we mean by security, anyway? There's an old joke in the security industry about how to secure any computer. Just unplug it. The problem is not only that the joke is becoming outdated in an era of wireless and rechargeable devices, but once a machine is plugged in, there are practically an infinite number of ways its use might deviate from its intended purpose. This deviation is a malfunction. When the difference between the expected behavior and actual behavior is caused by an adversary, as opposed to simple error or accident, then the malfunction is a security problem. Security isn't just the notion of being free from danger, as it is commonly conceived, but is associated with the presence of an adversary. In that way, it's a lot like war or sex. You need at least two sides to make it real. Things may break and mistakes may be made, but a cyber problem only becomes a cybersecurity issue if an adversary seeks to gain something from the activity, whether to obtain private information, undermine the system, or prevent its legitimate use. To illustrate, in 2011, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered nearly half of U.S. airspace shut down and more than 600 planes grounded. It seemed like a repeat of how American airspace was shut down after the 9/11 attacks. But this incident wasn't a security issue, as there was no one behind it. The cause was a software glitch in a single computer at the Atlanta headquarters building. Take the same situation and change the glitch to a hack. That's a security issue. The canonical goals of security in an information environment result from this notion of a threat. Traditionally, there are three goals. 1, confidentiality. 2, integrity. And 3, availability, sometimes called the CIA triad. Confidentiality refers to keeping data private. Privacy is not just some social or political goal. In a digital world, information has value. Protecting that information is thus of paramount importance. Not only must internal secrets and sensitive personal data be safeguarded, but transactional data can reveal important details about the relationships of firms or individuals. Confidentiality is supported by technical tools, such as encryption and access control, as well as legal protections. Integrity is the most subtle but maybe the most important of the classic information security triumvirate. Integrity means that the system and the data in it have not been improperly altered or changed without authorization. It is not just a matter of trust. There must be confidence that the system will be both available and behave as expected. Integrity's subtlety is what makes it a frequent target for the most sophisticated attackers. They will often first subvert the mechanisms that try to detect attacks, in the same way that complex diseases like HIV/AIDS go after the body's natural defenses, For instance, the Stuxnet attack, which we'll explore later in Part 2, was so jarring because the compromised computers were telling their Iranian operators that they were functionally normal, even as the Stuxnet virus was sabotaging them. How can we know whether a system is functioning normally if we depend on that system to tell us about its current function? And finally, availability means being able to use the system as anticipated. Here again, it's not merely the system going down that makes availability a security concern. Software errors and blue screens of death happen to our computers all the time. It becomes a security issue when and if someone tries to exploit the lack of availability in some way. An attacker could do this either by depriving users of a system that they depend on, such as how the loss of GPS would hamper military units in a conflict, or by merely threatening the loss of a system, known as a ransomware attack. Examples of such ransoms range from small-scale hacks on individual bank accounts all the way to global blackmail attempts against gambling websites before major sporting events like the World Cup and Super Bowl. Beyond this classic CIA triangle of security, we believe it is important to add another property, which is resilience. Resilience is what allows a system to endure security threats instead of critically failing. A key to resilience is accepting the inevitability of threats and even limited failures in your defenses. It's about remaining operational with the understanding that attacks and incidents happen on a continuous basis. Here again, there is a parallel to the human body. Your body still figures out a way to continue functioning even if your external layer of defense, your skin, is penetrated by a cut or even bypassed by an attack like a viral infection. Just as in the body, in the event of a cyber incident, the objective would be to prioritize resources and operations, protect key assets and systems from attacks, and ultimately restore normal operations. All of these aspects of security are not just technical issues. They are organizational, legal, economic, and social as well. But most importantly, when we think of security, we need to recognize its limits. Any gain in security always involves some sort of trade-off. Security costs money, but it also costs time, convenience, capabilities, liberties, and so on. Similarly, as we explore later on, the different threats to confidentiality, availability, integrity, and resiliency each require different responses. Short of pulling the plug, there's no such thing as absolute security. What are the threats? It sounds odd that reporters took a passenger jet to Idaho just to watch a cyber attack, but that's exactly what happened in 2011. Worried that the public did not understand the magnitude of growing cyber threats, the Department of Homeland Security flew journalists from around the country to the Idaho National Laboratory. Only 4 years earlier, the INL, an incredibly secure and secretive facility that houses a Department of Energy's nuclear research facility, had conducted a top-secret test to destroy a large generator via cyber attack. In 2011, in an effort to raise awareness about cyber threats, government experts not only declassified a video of the 2007 test, but held a public exercise for journalists to watch a faked cyber attack on a mock chemical plant. The government wanted to show that even their own experts couldn't prevent a team of hired hackers, known as a red team, from overwhelming the defenses of a critical facility. This episode is a good illustration of how those who professionally think and talk about cybersecurity worry that their discussions of threats are ignored or downplayed. Frustrated, the result is that they resort to turning up the volume to the proverbial 11, a la the movie Spinal Tap, conducting outlandish exercises and only talking about the matter in the most extreme ways that then echo out into the media and public. Indeed, following a series of warnings by U.S. government officials, by 2013, there were over 500,000 online references in the media to Cyber Pearl Harbor and another 250,000 to a feared Cyber 9/11. The complacency these experts worry about stems in part from our political system's reluctance to address difficult, complex problems in general, and cybersecurity in particular. But this kind of tenor also feeds into a misunderstanding of the threats. For example, 3 U.S. senators sponsored a large cybersecurity bill in the summer of 2011, and so wrote up an op-ed in the Washington Post urging support for their legislation. They cited a series of recent high-profile attacks, including those against the Citigroup and RSA companies, and the Stuxnet worms attack on Iranian nuclear research. The problem is that these 3 cases reflected wildly different threats. The Citigroup attack was about financial fraud. The RSA attack was industrial theft. And Stuxnet was a new form of warfare. They had little in common other than that they involved computers. When discussing cyber incidents or fears of potential incidents, it is important to separate the idea of vulnerability from threat. An unlocked door is a vulnerability, but not a threat if no one wants to enter. Conversely, one vulnerability can lead to many threats. That unlocked door could lead to terrorists sneaking in a bomb, competitors walking out with trade secrets, thieves purloining valuable goods, local hooligans vandalizing property, or even cats wandering in and distracting your staff by playing on the keyboards. The defining aspects of threats are the actor and the consequence. The acknowledgement of an actor forces us to think strategically about threats. The adversary can pick and choose which vulnerability to exploit for any given goal. This implies that we must not only address a range of vulnerabilities with respect to any given threat, but also understand that the threat may evolve in response to our defensive actions. There are many kinds of bad actors, but it is too easy to get lulled into using media cliches like hackers to lump them all together. An actor's objective is a good place to start when parceling them out. In the variety of attacks cited by the senators previously, the Citigroup attackers wanted account details about bank customers with an ultimate goal of financial theft. In the attack on RSA, the attackers wanted key business secrets in order to spy on other companies. For Stuxnet, a case we'll explore further in Part 2, the attackers wanted to disrupt industrial control processes involved in uranium enrichment so as to sabotage the Iranian nuclear program. Finally, it is useful to acknowledge when the danger comes from one of your own, as cases like Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks or Edward Snowden and the NSA scandal illustrate. The insider threat is particularly tough because the actor can search for vulnerabilities from within systems designed only to be used by trusted actors. Insiders can have much better perspectives on what is valuable and how best to leverage that value, whether they are trying to steal secrets or sabotage an operation. It is also important to consider whether the threat actor wants to attack you or just wants to attack. Some attacks target specific actors for particular reasons, while other adversaries go after a certain objective regardless of who may control it. Untargeted malicious code could, for example, infect a machine via email, search for stored credit card details of anyone, and relay those details back to its master without any human involvement. The key difference in these automated attacks is one of cost, both from the attacker's and the defender's perspective. For the attacker, automation hugely reduces cost, as they don't have to invest in all the tasks needed, from selecting the victim to identifying the asset to coordinating the attack. Their attack costs roughly the same no matter how many victims they get. A targeted attack, on the other hand, can quickly scale up in costs as the number of victims rises. These same dynamics shape the expected returns. To be willing to invest in targeted attacks, an attacker must have a higher expected return value with each victim. By contrast, automated attacks can have much lower profit margins. The good news is that there are only 3 things you can do to a computer: steal its data, misuse credentials, and hijack resources. Unfortunately, Our dependence on information systems means that a skilled actor could wreak a lot of damage by doing any one of these. Stolen data can reveal the strategic plans of a country or undermine the competitiveness of an entire industry. Stolen credentials can give the ability to change or destroy code and data, changing payrolls or opening up dams, as well as the ability to cover tracks. Hijacking resources can prevent a company from reaching customers or deny an army the ability to communicate. In the end, there are many things that can happen, but they have to be caused by someone. Threats should be assessed by understanding potential bad actors, what they are trying to do, and why. And you shouldn't need to fly all the way to Idaho to learn that. One fish, two fish, red fish, cyberfish. What are vulnerabilities? In 2011, London police confronted a mysterious and unusual spike in car thefts. The odd thing wasn't just that so many cars were being stolen, over 300 in all, but that the cars were all of a particular brand, new BMWs. And second, the thieves were somehow stealing hundreds of cars equipped with some of the most advanced car security systems in the world without activating the alarms. What the police soon figured out by watching hidden security camera footage of the thieves in action was that the robbers had figured out how to use the car's advanced technology against itself. First, they used radio frequency jammers to block the signal of a car's electronic key. Instead of the car owner locking the doors as they walked away, the doors would remain unlocked. Once in the car, the thief would then plug into the OBD2 connector, the electronic port that mechanics use to diagnose your car's problems, and then use that to obtain the car's unique key fob digital ID. Next, the thief would reprogram a blank electronic key to correspond to the car's ID. Then they simply drove away, with the owner of the advanced luxury car none the wiser. It all took only a few minutes. These vulnerabilities led to so many thefts that police resorted to leaving paper leaflets on all BMWs parked in London, warning them of the danger. The case of the lost luxury cars is a good illustration of how building a complex system can create new openings and hidden vulnerabilities that bad guys can try to exploit. Different vulnerabilities allow an attacker to achieve different goals. In some cases, it might be the ability to read confidential data, or the goal could be the ultimate prize, compromise of the entire system. When the attacker has such root access, meaning the ability to execute any command, the victim is completely vulnerable, or what hackers call pwned. An apocryphal story is that a hacker meant to type that a target was now owned, but he typed too fast, mistakenly hit the P key right next to the O, and a cool term was born. Often the easiest way to gain control of the system is simply to ask. A time-honored tradition for breaking into systems from hacking's earliest days is to call up a low-level employee, claim to be from technical support, and ask for the person's password. This falls into the category of what is known as social engineering, manipulating people into revealing confidential information and thereby helping the attacker. The manipulation can take many forms, often with the attacker trying to set up a scenario designed to encourage cooperation through psychological mechanisms. Fear is a powerful motivator. When a user's computer displays a message threatening to expose activities on a pornographic website, fear of exposure can motivate payment. More often, however, users just follow social cues. In our daily lives, we regularly encounter problems that need fixing, like a program that won't close until you just click here, or people who need your help, like your Aunt Susie, who somehow got robbed in Iceland and needs you to wire her money via Bangkok. A particularly common form of social engineering is the phishing attack. Phishing emails look like official emails from the victim's bank, employer, or some other trusted entity. They claim to require some action by the victim, perhaps to correct an account error or see a message on Facebook, and fool victims into visiting a website where they are asked to enter their credentials. If the victim enters his or her account details, the attacker can now do anything with that information, from transfer money, to read confidential emails. The phony credentials web page may have a URL that looks similar to the authentic one. If you don't look closely, maybe paypi.com, spelled P-A-Y-P-A-I, looks like paypal.com. In sophisticated phishing attacks, the fake page may also actually log the user into the real website to minimize the chance of detection. One of the most challenging subsets of these phishing attacks is known as spear phishing. These target not just networks, but key individuals inside those networks. It's the difference between you, along with scores of other people, receiving an email from that kind Nigerian prince who just needs your bank account information, versus receiving an email that looks exactly like it's from your mother. This is a good illustration of the difference between the automated and targeted threats you heard about in the last section. Such specialized attacks require prior intelligence gathering to figure out how to trick a particular person and are mostly reserved for prime targets. Attackers also prey on systems that have ignored basic precautions, such as products that have default login names and passwords, which users often forget to change. Most home wireless routers have default passwords that a shocking number of users leave in place. Find the right one, and it's easy to steal a neighbor's Wi-Fi and eavesdrop on their conversations. This kind of vulnerability can also be created by product manufacturers that don't prioritize security enough or fail to factor in the likely human errors and even laziness of their customers. For instance, Microsoft's database product, MS SQL 2005, shipped without an administrator password so that any user could control the entire database until an admin password was set. Other situations involve systems that have features that may be convenient but represent real security vulnerabilities, like that of the BMW remote access keys. Applications can also create vulnerabilities if they are misconfigured. In one study, researchers at Dartmouth searched peer-to-peer file sharing services, where users share specific files from their own computers with others, usually entertainment files like movies or TV shows. Because of misconfigured settings, in addition to users sharing episodes of Game of Thrones, a large number also had unintentionally shared personal bank statements and tax documents. A similar study found that large financial institutions were unintentionally leaking highly sensitive internal documents through misconfigured applications. Another vector is mistakes in the systems themselves, software vulnerabilities that are exploited by more advanced attackers. It is practically impossible to build a modern IT system without some hidden vulnerabilities waiting to be discovered. Modern operating systems have millions of lines of code and have hundreds of subcomponents that interact. An attacker's goal is to find some chink in the armor of this code where the system does not behave precisely as designed and exploit that weakness. An attack that exploits a previously unknown vulnerability is known as a zero-day. The term comes from the notion that the attacks take place on the 0th day of awareness that the rest of the world has of these vulnerabilities, and thus before a patch to fix it can be implemented. There are different types of vulnerabilities with different ways of exploiting them, but a common approach is to find some way of tricking the victim's computer into executing the attacker's commands rather than the intended programs. A key is that most computer systems treat data as both information to be processed and commands to be executed. This principle is foundational to the very idea of the modern computer, but also a major source of insecurity. A good illustration is an SQL, pronounced SQL, injection, one of the most common ways a website is attacked. Many web applications are built on a structured query language, SQL, a type of programming language used to manage data. It's a highly effective system that dates back to the 1970s, but an attacker, instead of entering a name and address as requested, can enter specifically crafted commands that the database will read and interpret as program code, rather than just data to be stored. These commands can be used to learn about the database, read data, and create new accounts. In some cases, access can be used to discover and change security settings on the server, allowing the attacker to control the entire web system. As we explore later in the Part 2 section on hacktivists, the anonymous group used this kind of attack to penetrate the security firm H.B. Gary and share its embarrassing secrets with the world. Beyond attacking applications, attackers can also exploit vulnerabilities in code at the system level. A common vulnerability is the buffer overflow. Computers use memory to store data in instructions. If a program can be tricked into writing inputted data that is larger than expected, it can spill over the allocated buffer, or storage area, and overwrite the space where the computer stores the next instruction to be executed. If that newly written memory space is then read and interpreted by the computer, the program can break or follow the attacker's instructions. Once the program executes arbitrary instructions, the attacker can effectively gain control of the system. In essence, it follows the same principle as the SQL attack, where the computer interprets data as instructions, but now it takes place at the system memory level. Designing these types of attacks requires a great deal of skill and experience, but once the vulnerability has been exploited, it is relatively easy to package. This exploit is a piece of software or set of commands that can take advantage of the vulnerability. And that is where cyber risk takes on a whole new level of concern, as it allows other, less sophisticated attackers in on the action. It's as if the master thief now writes a book about safecracking that comes with a handy-dandy set of tools. Malicious software, or malware, is a prepackaged exploitation of a vulnerability. There is often a payload of instructions detailing what the system should do after it has been compromised. Some types of malware contain instructions for reproduction in order to spread the attack. Worms spread themselves automatically over the network. In some cases, this can be sufficient to cause drastic harm. Many of the worms that attacked Microsoft Windows in the late 1990s and early 2000s had no direct malicious effect, but still overwhelmed corporate networks because they tried to send out an exponentially large number of copies. One worm even sought to patch vulnerable computers, a good worm, but still managed to cripple networks. Other vulnerabilities have been exploited to allow the attacker to capture valuable personal data, or in an anarchistic turn, just destroy data on the victim's computer. Malware can also be spread over the web via drive-by attacks, where the victim's only mistake is visiting the wrong website. Such attacks exploit vulnerabilities in the web browser or in the many components and add-ons that web browsers use to take advantage of sophisticated websites. The attacker first compromises the web server and then simply attempts to exploit vulnerabilities in any browser that requests files from that website. Drive-by attackers often target groups by going after websites used by specific communities. A so-called watering hole attack, taken from the ideas that smart lions don't chase after their prey across the African savanna, but rather just wait for them all to come to the watering hole. For example, a group out to steal secrets from a U.S. defense company indirectly targeted it by compromising the website of a popular aerospace magazine that many employees read. In one case, a watering hole attack infected 500 accounts in a single day. More recently, malware has been used not only to take control of a computer system, but to keep control of that computer in order to exploit its computational and network resources. By capturing victims' systems and coordinating their behavior, attackers can assemble armies of zombie computers. Millions of machines can be controlled by a single actor through a range of different command and control mechanisms. These are referred to as botnets, and most computer users will never know if they are part of one. Botnets are powerful resources for a host of nefarious activities. Regular access to the victim's machines allows monitoring to capture valuable data. Botnet controllers can also leverage the network connections of their victim systems to send spam, host websites to sell illegal products, or defraud online advertisers. Perhaps most insidiously, botnets can launch a distributed denial of service attack known by the acronym DDoS or DDoS. DDoS attacks target the subsystems that handle connections to the Internet, such as web servers. Their vulnerabilities are based on the principle that responding to an incoming query consumes computational and bandwidth resources. If someone were to call your phone incessantly, you would first lose the ability to concentrate, and then lose the ability to use your phone for any other purpose. Similarly, in the cyber world, if the attacker can overwhelm the connection link, the system is effectively removed from the Internet. It is fairly easy to defend against a single attacker from a fixed source. One just has to block the sender, just like blocking an annoying caller's number, but never your mother's. Never. In a distributed denial-of-service attack, the attacker uses a botnet of thousands or even millions to overwhelm the victim. It's the equivalent of having thousands or even millions of people trying to call your phone. Not only would you get nothing done, but the calls you actually want to receive wouldn't easily get through. This kind of power and the fact that such attacks are fairly overt and obvious means that DDoS attacks are often linked to some other goals. Criminal gangs may go to a website and threaten to take it offline unless they pay for protection. "That's a nice website you've got there. It'd be a real shame if anything were to happen." Or they may also be used as a diversion to overwhelm the attention and defenses of the victim while going after data elsewhere. They are also increasingly common as a form of political protest or even suppression. During the initial stages of the crisis in Syria in 2011, supporters of the Syrian regime shared DDoS tools to attack critics of the government and news organizations that covered the growing violence. The bottom line is that vulnerabilities exist on every type of information system in cyberspace. Despite how scary they sound, many of them are not new. For instance, the common buffer overflow attack was first developed in the 1970s and almost brought down the adolescent Internet in the 1980s. By 1996, a detailed how-to guide appeared in a hacker's magazine. As threats evolve, so too must our responses to them. Some can be mitigated with small changes in behavior or tweaks in code, while whole classes of vulnerabilities can be prevented only by developing and implementing new technologies. Other vulnerabilities are simply a structural consequence of how we use systems. As we explore in Part 3, how to navigate these challenges comes down to accepting that bad guys are out there to exploit these vulnerabilities, and then developing the best possible responses that allow us to keep benefiting from the good parts of the cyber age. Or you could opt out, sell your advanced luxury car, and ride the bus instead. Just make sure you don't check the bus schedule online. How do we trust in cyberspace? There is perhaps no more important duty for a citizen than to vote, and no part of the voting process is more important than preserving the integrity of that vote. And yet, the founding fathers of American democracy didn't imagine a world of computerized voting machines, nor one in which Pac-Man might chomp his way into an election. The incident started out as one of those fun projects that hackers like to undertake, spending a few afternoons playing around with an old piece of computer equipment. The difference here was the hardware in question was an AVC Edge electronic voting machine used in the 2008 elections. Such systems are supposed to be tamper-proof, or at least reveal if anyone tries to doctor them. Yet the two young researchers from the University of Michigan and Princeton were able to reprogram the machine without leaving any sign on the tamper-resistant seals. While they chose to reprogram the voting machine to innocuously play Pac-Man, the beloved 1980s video game, they made it clear that the supposedly tamper-proof machine was vulnerable to far more insidious attacks. As the incident shows, our dependence on digital systems means that increasingly we face the question of how we can trust them. For cybersecurity, the users must trust the systems, and the systems must know how to trust the users. Not every machine is going to have an unwanted Pac-Man on the screen to tell us something is wrong. How do we know that the computer is behaving as we expect it to, or that an email from our colleague is actually from that colleague? And just as importantly, how do computers know if we are supposed to be and are behaving the way we're supposed to? Online trust is built on cryptography, the practice of secure communications that goes all the way back to the first codes that Julius Caesar and his generals used to keep their enemies from understanding their secret messages. We often think of cryptography as a means of keeping information confidential, but it also plays an equally important role in integrity, or the ability to detect any tampering. The key building block in cryptography is the hash. A hash function takes a piece of data and maps it to a smaller set-length output with two specific properties. First, the function is one-way, which makes it very difficult to determine the original data from the output. Second, and even more important, it is incredibly hard to find two input pieces of data that generate the same output hash. This lets us use the hash function to fingerprint a document or an email. This fingerprint can then verify the integrity of a document. If a trusted fingerprint of a document does not match the fingerprint that you generate yourself using the same method, then you have a different document. Cryptographic integrity checks are useful, but for them to apply to trust, we need some means to introduce identity. Trust is both a noun and a transitive verb, after all. It requires someone or something to trust. Cryptographic digital signatures provide that trust by using asymmetric encryption. This explanation is starting to get complex, so it might be useful to take a brief diversion into understanding a few basic points of cryptography. Modern crypto systems rely on keys as the secret way of coding or decoding information on which trust is built. Symmetric encryption relies on sharing the same key with the other trusted parties. I encrypt data with the same key that you use to decrypt it. It's like us both sharing the same key for a bank lockbox. But what if we have never met each other? How will we exchange those secret keys securely? Asymmetric cryptography solves this problem. The idea is to separate a secret key into a public key, which is shared with everyone, and a private key that remains secret. The two keys are generated such that something that is encrypted with a public key is decrypted with the corresponding private key, and vice versa. Suppose Alice and Bob, the classical alphabetical protagonists of cryptographic examples, want to communicate. They each have a pair of keys and can access each other's public keys. If Alice wants to send Bob a message, she encrypts the message with Bob's public key. Then the only person who can decrypt it must have access to Bob's private key. A digital signature of a message ties together the notion of a digital fingerprint with public key cryptography. Returning to our friends, Alice takes the fingerprint of the document and signs it with her private key and passes it to Bob, along with the unencrypted document. Bob verifies the signature using Alice's public key and compares it with a fingerprint he can generate of the unencrypted document. If they don't match, then someone has changed the document in between. These digital signatures can provide integrity for any type of data and can be chained to allow for transitive trust. But where does the trust come from in the first place? For example, I can verify that software I have downloaded from a company is valid by checking it against the company's public key, but how do I know that the key actually belongs to that company? Remember, a signature only implies access to the private key that corresponds with the public key, not the validity of that public key. Asymmetric cryptography requires some means of trusting the public keys. In most modern systems, we rely on a trusted third party. These are organizations that produce signed digital certificates that explicitly tie an entity to a public key. Known as certificate authorities, or CAs, they sign their certificates, and their public keys are known widely enough so that they cannot be spoofed. If you trust the CA, then you can trust the public key signed by the CA. Every person online uses this system on a daily basis, even if we do not realize it. When we visit HTTPS web addresses and get the little lock icon to verify the secure connection, we are visiting a secure website and are trusting the certificate authorities. Our web browsers ask the secure domain for its public key and a certificate signed by a CA, tying the public key explicitly to the Internet domain. In addition to verifying that the server our browser is talking to belongs to the organization it claims to belong to, this also enables trusted communication by exchanging encryption keys. Such trust serves as the basis for almost all secure communication on the Internet between unaffiliated parties. As the source of trust, certificate authorities occupy a critical role in the cyberspace ecosystem, perhaps too important. If someone can steal a CA's signing key, then the thief, or whoever they pass the key on to, could intercept secure traffic without the victim noticing. It's hard to pull off, but it has been done. In 2011, someone, later leaks fingered the NSA, stole the Dutch CA's keys and used them to intercept Iranian users' access to Google's Gmail. Some have complained that there are too many CAs around the world, many in countries with less than savory histories in security and privacy. As attacks evolve, the roots of trust will be even more at risk. If one side of trust online is about the user feeling confident about the system and other users, the other side is how systems should trust the users. After identification and authentication, a system must authorize the user to use the system. Most systems use some kind of access control to determine who can do what. At its simplest, access control provides the ability to read, write, or execute code in an operating environment. The core of any system is the access control policy, a matrix of subjects and objects that defines who can do what to whom. This can be simple, such as employees can read any document in their small work group, while managers can access any document in their larger division, or much more complicated. For example, a doctor may read any patient's file as long as that patient has one symptom that meets a pre-specified list, but may only write to that file after the billing system can verify eligibility for payment. Good access control policies require a clear understanding of both organizational roles and the architecture of the information system, as well as the ability to anticipate future needs. For large organizations whose users make extensive use of data, defining this policy perfectly is incredibly difficult. Many believe it may be impossible. Failures of access control have been behind some of the more spectacular cyber-related scandals in recent years, like the case of Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks in 2010, which we explore next, and the 2013 Edward Snowden case, where a low-level contractor working as a systems administrator at the NSA had access to a trove of controversial and top-secret programs which he leaked to the press. These cases illustrate poor access control in all its glory, from low-level individuals being granted default access to anything and everything they wanted, to poor efforts to log and audit access. For several months after Edward Snowden went public with leaked documents about its various monitoring programs, the NSA still didn't know how many more documents he had taken, but hadn't released yet. Whether the organization is the NSA or a cupcake store, the questions about how data is compartmentalized are essential. Unfortunately, most organizations either greatly over-provision or under-provision access, rather than trying to find a good medium. Over-entitlements grant too much access to too many without a clear stake in the enterprise, leading to potentially catastrophic WikiLeaks-type breaches. In many business fields, such as finance and healthcare, this kind of over-access even runs the risk of violating conflict of interest laws that are supposed to prevent individuals from having access to certain types of information. Finally, and most relevant to cybersecurity, if access control is poor, organizations can even lose protection of their intellectual property under trade secret law. At the other extreme, under-entitlement has its own risks. In business, one department may inadvertently undermine another if it doesn't have access to the same data. In a hospital, it can literally be a matter of life and death if doctors cannot easily find out information they need to know in an emergency. Former intelligence officials have implied that the stakes are even higher in their world, where a lack of information sharing can leave crucial dots unconnected and terrorist plots like 9/11 missed. What this all illustrates is that even amid a discussion of technology, hashes, and access control, trust always comes back to human psychology and the decisions used to make explicit risk calculations. Pac-Man isn't an actual man, but the system that allowed him to enter a voting machine and the consequences of that access are all too human. Focus. What happened in WikiLeaks? Bradass87. Hypothetical question. If you had free reign over classified networks for long periods of time, say 8 to 9 months, and you saw incredible things, awful things, things that belonged in the public domain and not on some server stored in a dark room in Washington, D.C., what would you do? 12:21:24 p.m. Bradass87. Say, a database of 500,000 events during the Iraq War, from 2004 to 2009, with reports, date-time groups, lat-long locations, casualty figures, or 260,000 State Department cables from embassies and consulates all over the world, explaining how the First World exploits the Third in detail from an internal perspective. 12:26:09 p.m. Bradass87. Let's just say someone I know intimately well has been penetrating U.S. classified networks, mining data like the ones described, and then transferring that data from the classified networks over the air gap onto a commercial network computer, sorting the data, compressing it, encrypting it, and uploading it to a crazy white-haired Aussie who can't seem to stay in one country very long. Equals L. 12:31:43 p.m. Bradass87. Crazy white-haired dude equals Julian Assange. 12:33:05 p.m. Bradass87. In other words, I've made a huge mess. This exchange on AOL Instant Messenger launched one of the biggest incidents in cyber history. WikiLeaks not only changed the way the world thinks about diplomatic secrets, but also became a focal point for understanding how radically cyberspace has changed our relationship with data and access. In 2006, the website WikiLeaks was launched with the goal of exposing corruption and abuse around the world. With an agenda that scholars call radical transparency, the concept was to reform powerful actors' behavior by exposing documented evidence of their wrongdoing online. Led by the now iconic crazy white-haired dude, Australian Julian Assange, it used the Wikipedia model of an open-source, democratic intelligence agency, where activists from around the world could upload information and share it through a central but communally archived repository. The group quickly gained a reputation for releasing information relating to a range of very different countries and to potential corruption, malfeasance, or ineptitude. Early projects exposed alleged wrongdoings by Kenyan politicians, Church of Scientology lawyers, and international trade negotiators. It soon won accolades from anti-censorship and human rights organizations. In turn, the dangers of radical transparency quickly became apparent to organizations that depended on secrecy. In a 2008 report, the Pentagon noted, WikiLeaks.org represents a potential force protection, counterintelligence, OPSEC, and InfoSec threat to the U.S. Army. Ironically, we only know about this classified assessment because WikiLeaks itself published it in 2010. The Pentagon's prescience was remarkable, as the website was poised to publish a massive cache of documents that ranged from diplomatic cables to memos and videos directly related to the U.S. military's war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. This story's beginning goes back to Bradass87, the online handle of Bradley Manning, born in 1987. Bradley Manning was a private first class in the U.S. Army and not a terribly happy one. As he described in instant messages sent to another hacker-turned-journalist, I'm an Army intelligence analyst deployed to eastern Baghdad, pending discharge for adjustment disorder in lieu of gender identity disorder. Later investigations found that Manning fit in poorly with other soldiers and that he had already been reprimanded for disclosing too much information and video messages to his friends and family that he posted to YouTube. In fact, he almost wasn't deployed to Iraq because his superiors had described him as a risk to himself and possibly others. But the need for intelligence workers in the field was too great, and he was sent to the war zone. While Manning was trained to handle classified information, he was not an analyst. Instead, his job was to make sure that other intelligence analysts in his group had access to everything that they were entitled to see. His position thus gave him access to a huge range of data streams from across the government's computer networks. After growing increasingly distraught about the war, a reaction likely compounded by his personal troubles, Manning decided that information has to be free. While the Department of Defense had banned USB storage devices for fear of malware, and had tried to air-gap the secure networks from the Internet, they did not close off writable CD drives. Manning would bring in CDs with music on them, and then overwrite the music with file upon file of classified data. As he wrote, "I listened and lip-synced to Lady Gaga's telephone while exfiltrating possibly the largest data spillage in American history." In April 2010, WikiLeaks published a provocatively titled video titled Collateral Murder, depicting an edited, annotated video from a U.S. Army Apache attack helicopter firing on civilians in Iraq, including 2 Reuters reporters. WikiLeaks followed this up in July and October 2010 by releasing immense troves of classified documents relating to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. While Manning had originally wanted to remain anonymous, as was the WikiLeaks model, his facilitator, Assange, instead sought to achieve maximum publicity. The video was first displayed at a news conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. For the classified documents, Assange worked with the New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel to verify, analyze, and present the documents to the public. Unsurprisingly, U.S. officials condemned the release of these documents in strong language and began to hunt down the source of the leaks. Just a few months later, WikiLeaks dropped another virtual bomb. In what became known as Cablegate, Manning had also passed on 251,287 State Department cables written by 271 American embassies and consulates in 180 countries, dating from December 1966 to February 2010. Much of the communication was boring stuff, but there were also a number of embarrassing secrets. From what American ambassadors really thought about their counterparts, to the fact that the United States had secretly eavesdropped on the UN Secretary-General in the lead-up to the Iraq War. Amusingly, the U.S. government then ordered federal employees and contractors not to read the secret State Department documents posted online, which the New York Times described as a classic case of shutting the barn door after the horses left. Originally, WikiLeaks relied on media sources like The Guardian, El País, and Le Monde to publish the cables, which they did at a relative trickle. The media focused on what they thought was most newsworthy and edited the content whenever it might endanger someone inadvertently revealed in the cables, such as a secret informant. Only 100 or so were released at the time, a tiny fraction of the stolen documents. A few months later, however, the password to the full data set was accidentally released. Reporters from The Guardian and Assange each blamed the other. With the site now accessible, WikiLeaks decided to publish the whole treasure trove of secret information, unredacted. The leaking of documents was roundly condemned, and WikiLeaks was accused of putting people at risk, and not just American officials. In China, for instance, nationalist groups began an online witch hunt, threatening violence against any Chinese dissident listed in the cables as meeting with the U.S. Embassy. At this point, WikiLeaks became more than just a nuisance to those in power. According to the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, the leaks risked major impacts on our national security, and a senator called for Assange to be tried for espionage. Others sought to downplay the impact. As then Secretary of Defense Gates put it, "Is this embarrassing? Yes. Is it awkward? Yes. Consequences for U.S. foreign policy? I think fairly modest." In either case, the heat was turned up on the organization and its key players. Assange's personal Swiss bank account was closed on the grounds that he had falsely claimed to live in Geneva upon opening the account. Even more damaging, Swedish prosecutors issued a warrant for Assange for sexual assault. After fighting and losing a legal battle for extradition, Assange sought asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he remains at the time of this book's publication. In another illustration of how the cyber world intersects with the real world, the online group was also pressured via the online financial front. PayPal announced that it would no longer allow individuals to send money to WikiLeaks' account, citing a letter from the U.S. government declaring WikiLeaks' engagement in illegal behavior. MasterCard and Visa followed suit, making it much harder for sympathizers around the world to contribute to the legal and technical defense of the website. Despite the pressure, the WikiLeaks organization survived. The leaked documents are still available around the web on dozens of mirror websites to anyone who wants to see them, aside from federal employees, while the group has popped up in subsequent scandals, from the NSA domestic spying revelations to the Syria files, a release of over 2 million emails from the Syrian regime, including personal emails from Bashar al-Assad. More importantly, WikiLeaks' model has proved powerful, inspiring copycat attempts like Local Leaks, a website associated with Anonymous. Local Leaks came to prominence in 2012 when it posted evidence of a brutal sexual assault by prominent high school football players in an Ohio town. As for Manning, his role was revealed by the very same person he shared his supposedly secret internet chat with. A hacker named Adrian Lamo had told Manning, "I'm a journalist and a minister. You can pick either and treat this as a confession or an interview, never to be published, and enjoy a modicum of legal protection." Instead, Lamo turned Manning into the FBI. Manning was subsequently court-martialed for the data theft and espionage and sentenced to 35 years in military prison. In the end, those who wish to set information free are themselves no longer free. Others may be deterred by what has happened to this episode's main characters, or heartened by their enduring impact. What is an Advanced Persistent Threat, APT? We were at a meeting of Washington, D.C. government officials and business leaders. A so-called consultant in cybersecurity, at least that's what his website said, and who are we to question the internet, spent half his presentation talking of the massive boogeyman of cyber danger that loomed for us all, repeatedly mentioning the new specter of APTs. But fortunately, he spent the second half of his talk explaining how all that was needed to deter such threats was to be good enough. He made a joke that it was like the two friends chased by a bear. As one told the other, "I don't have to outrun the bear, just you." As long as you made sure your defenses were slightly better than the next guy's, he explained, the cyber attackers would give up and quickly move on. And, lo and behold, his firm had a generic package for sale that would satisfy all our cybersecurity needs. The presentation was slick, effective, and wrong. APTs are advanced persistent threats, a phenomenon that has gained more and more notoriety in recent years. Google reports the term as being used some 10 million times by 2013, but is still poorly understood. It illustrates the challenge in the policy world of calling attention to very real emerging challenges in cyberspace, but also avoiding overreaction, hype, and hysteria. If cybersecurity threats were movies, an advanced persistent threat would be the Ocean's 11 of the field. It's not that APTs star handsome actors like George Clooney or Brad Pitt. Indeed, they are more likely to be run by their polar opposites, clad in T-shirts instead of Armani suits. Like the high-profile heists in the movie, however, APTs have a level of planning that sets them apart from other cyber threats. They are the work of a team that combines organization, intelligence, complexity, and patience. And, as with the movie, they are quickly followed by sequels. No one knows how many APTs are out there in the world, but one cybersecurity firm's CEO told us how, 5 years ago, I would get very excited and very proud if we found signs of an APT inside a client's networks. It was something that might happen once every few months. Now, we're finding them once a day. An APT starts with a specific target. The team knows what it wants and who it is going after to get it. APT targets have ranged from military jet designs to oil company trade secrets. So, while many of us would like to think that we are important enough to be targeted by an APT, the reality is that most of us don't rise to that level. But if you do, well, watch out. Locking your windows like everyone else in the neighborhood probably isn't going to be enough. The bear in the sales guy's story actually doesn't care how fast your friend runs. It just wants to take a bite out of you. The hallmark of an APT is its coordinated team of specialized experts who each take on different roles. Much like a robber casing a bank or a spy observing a military base, a surveillance team engages in what is known as target development, learning everything it can about the person or organization it is going after, along with key vulnerabilities. In this effort, online search tools and social networking have been a godsend to the attackers. Want to steal a widget and therefore need to know who the vice president of product development is? In the past, you might have sent James Bond to seduce the receptionist in human resources, and then sneak into her files while she was sleeping off a night of shaken martinis and sex. Now, it's more boring. Just type the name into an internet search engine, and you can get everything from that executive's resume to the name of his daughter's pet iguana. As cybersecurity expert Gary McGraw notes, the most impressive tool in the attacker's arsenal is Google. It is this phase that also differentiates the attacks as persistent. The reconnaissance and preparations can take months. The teams are not just trying to understand the organization of the target, but also its key concerns and even tendencies. One APT, for example, was casing a major technology firm headquartered in Minnesota. Team members eventually figured out that the best way to crack the system was to wait until a major blizzard. Then, they sent a fake email about the firm changing its snow day policy. In Minnesota, this was something that everyone from the CEO on down cared about. Another effort, which American national security officials have blamed on Chinese intelligence and military units, gathered details not only on targets' key friends and associates, but even what farewell they typically use to sign off on their emails. For example, all the best versus best regards versus keep on truckin', to mimic it for a spear phishing attack vector. With a target understood, an intrusion team will then work to breach the system. What's notable here, though, is that the initial target is frequently not the main prize. An effective way into a network is via trusted outsiders, who often have lower levels of defense, or by targeting people in the network who have some access permissions to open the gates wider. For example, a series of American think tanks, including our place of work, were targeted in 2011 and again in 2012 by an APT that sought access to the accounts of scholars who worked on Asian security issues. They were interested not just in their files but also their address books, which had the contact information for senior government leaders. But the APT initially went after other employees who had administrative rights and access to passwords. These attackers frequently use spear phishing and faked emails, with some exploit hidden inside, triggering a download of malware. In Operation Shady Rat, an APT we talk about later on in Part 2, when the counterfeit email attachment was opened, malware was implanted. This then created a backdoor communication channel to another outside web server that had, in turn, been compromised with hidden instructions in the web page's code, an effort by the attackers to cover their tracks. The malware used in these attacks is often quite sophisticated. The emphasis is on stealth, so the authors will not only try to hide from traditional antivirus defenses, but burrow deep into networks and operating systems to avoid discovery, attempting to impersonate legitimate network traffic. Like other businesses, APT groups often conduct dry runs and even quality assurance tests to minimize the number of antivirus programs that can detect them. But email is not the only way in. Other APTs have, for example, used networks like Facebook to find friends of individuals with a high level of privilege inside a targeted network. Then, they compromised these friends' instant messaging chats to sneak in. Perhaps the most interesting example of this use of social networking tools saw senior British officials and defense officials tricked into accepting friend requests from a faked Facebook account that claimed to be Admiral James Stavridis, the commander of NATO. Who wouldn't want an admiral as a friend? Imagine their disappointment when it turned out to be a hacker. Once the team is in, they branch out like a viral infection, often with more personnel joining the effort. They jump from the initial footholds, compromising additional machines inside the network that can run the malware and be used to enter and leave. This often involves installing keystroke logging software that tracks what people are typing and a command and control program that can direct the malicious code to seek out sensitive information. At this point, the target is pwned. Now, at the mercy of the attackers, an exfiltration team works to retrieve the information the APT was targeting all along. Here is another APT hallmark. Instead of the usual criminal ethic of grab what you can, they go after very specific files. Frequently, the attackers don't even open the files, suggesting that their reconnaissance was so thorough that they don't need to review what they were targeting. Instead, someone draws up a specific list of collection requirements, and the team is disciplined enough to stick to it. Not all APTs just copy and exit with data. Some add technology to allow them to steal new secrets beyond what was inside the network or even gain control. French officials, for example, have accused APTs linked to Chinese intelligence of gaining access to the computers of several high-level French political and business leaders, and then activating microphones and web cameras so that they could eavesdrop on conversations. Even more nefarious are those that don't simply steal data, but also alter files, which, as we explore later, can have major consequences. This ultimately shifts the APT from an act of crime or espionage to an act of sabotage, or even war. The exfiltration phase, when massive amounts of data leave the network, such as when an entire email file exits, is actually when many successful APTs are detected. This phone home phase makes for an anomaly in network traffic that is hard to mask. Exfiltration teams therefore use all sorts of tricks to sneak the information out and then hide their tracks. One common tactic involves routing data through way stations in multiple countries, akin to a money launderer running stolen funds through banks all over the world. This not only makes it more difficult to track them down, but also routes the APT's activities through different countries and legal jurisdictions, ultimately complicating prosecution. What makes APTs even more of a challenge is that when a target finally realizes it has been attacked, the pain is not over. Finding which machines inside the system have been infected can take months. Even worse, if the effort is truly persistent, say if the target has some sort of ongoing value to the attacker, there might be an additional unit in the APT whose very job it is to maintain an electronic foothold in the network. Rather than focusing on what information to steal, this unit will monitor internal emails to learn how the defenders are trying to get them out. In one case, an American company hired a Pentagon-qualified computer security firm to clean its infected network after being targeted by an APT. Despite this, a few months later, a thermostat and printer in its building were caught sending messages to a server located in China. With their e-communication compromised, the defenders' response is often to go old school. They will, literally, yank hard drives out of their computers and post handwritten signs in the hallways about password policy changes. APTs are a nightmare scenario for any organization. Most don't know they've been targeted until it's too late. And even if they do find out, it is often impossible to prove who's behind it. Indeed, that's why APTs may be the most controversial of all the threat vectors. Except in cases where the attackers are sloppy, our favorite example being when a very high-ranking Chinese military officer employed the same server to communicate with his mistress and coordinate an APT. there is little actual proof that would stand up in a court of law or sway a country's position. What we are often left with instead are suspicions and finger-pointing, which makes APTs so poisonous for diplomatic relations, as we've seen over the last few years between the United States and China. How do we keep the bad guys out? The basics of computer defense. It is by far the world's largest zoo. In 2013, it held more than 110 million different species painstakingly collected from the wild. And yet, it is a strange sort of zoo, where you can't actually see the animals. The reason is that they only exist in the virtual world. The McAfee Malware Zoo is what the computer security firm calls its collection of the various types of malicious or malevolent software, known as malware, designed to wreak havoc on Internet users. Its growth illustrates the seemingly insurmountable scale of the problem. In 2010, McAfee thought it impressive that it was discovering a new specimen of malware every 15 minutes. In 2013, it was discovering one every single second. If we think of each type of malware as a unique threat, these numbers are overwhelming. Instead, we must understand why there are so many unique threats. The answer reflects the cat-and-mouse game that attackers and defenders play. Since the early Internet, attackers have tried to exploit vulnerabilities, and the defenders have sought to deny them. The adversaries, in turn, adapted and altered their patterns of attack, changing it into an evolutionary game. The advantage of defending a computer system is that once you know what might attack you, you can just tell the computer what to watch for and how to avoid it. Traditional antivirus software relies on detecting these signatures. The program scans all files on the system, as well as incoming traffic, against a dictionary of known malware, looking for anything that matches these signatures of malice. This classic approach has a few glaring flaws. As the number of attacks grow over time, these definition files and the time it takes to search them also grow. Most of these old signatures don't represent current threats, and as the threats proliferate, it becomes a losing game. One study found that only 0.34% of signatures in common antivirus programs are needed to detect all the malware found in all incoming email, and yet, prudence dictates that we still must look for the 99.66% of the old malware, just in case the attacker gets sneaky and goes back to them. The bigger problem is evolution. Authors of malware have fought back against the traditional antivirus approach by taking a page from biology. Just as some viruses, such as HIV and the flu, change their protein coatings to avoid detection by the human immune system, malware creators change the outward appearance of their attacking programs. The very same attack can be made into very different signatures, disguised by programs that automatically generate new features. This gives rise to enormous numbers, like those reflected in the zoo statistics cited previously, and renders the old approach of detection by signature less useful. One analysis found that, over an 8-day period, while over 100,000 new signatures of new known malware were added to a major antivirus vendor into the list of what to scan for, only 12 new detections resulted. 12 detections for processing 100,000 signatures may seem paltry, but this reflects the camouflage techniques used by malware authors more than ineptitude on the part of antivirus companies. Inflating the number of signatures may make the malware problem seem bigger than it is, but it would be equally wrong to conclude that malware is not a problem at all. Security vendors have thus had to change how they detect malicious code. Modern antivirus does not screen. They use heuristic detections to identify suspicious computer code behavior based on rules and logical analysis. Static analysis breaks apart the computer code and looks for patterns associated with the behavior of an attacker. Virtual machines and other sophisticated defenses dynamically simulate the code operation to determine whether the file examined will misbehave without putting the actual system at risk. Just as police bomb squads test suspicious packages, virtual detonation chambers, can cause an incoming piece of malware to mistakenly think it is inside the machine and detonate prematurely. If securing a modern operating system is difficult, an alternate approach tries to prevent the bad stuff from reaching the computer over the network. The simplest form of network defense is a firewall. Taken from the concept of barriers built into cars or buildings to prevent fires from spreading, computer firewalls are like filters that reject traffic based on specific rules. Firewalls can prevent external computers from connecting to the firewalled machines except under preset circumstances, or prevent certain applications on the computer from opening network connections. Firewalls are filters that only permit valid activity on the network. The next layer of defense is a set of sensors that look for invalid behavior. Intrusion detection systems exist at the computer level or on the network. They detect attack signatures and identify anomalous behavior. Well, that's funny. The janitor's computer doesn't usually open an encrypted connection with Moldova at 2 in the morning. These systems alert administrators to potential attacks and keep logs for detailed forensic analysis. Most detection systems now have some intrusion prevention capacity as well, which closes suspicious network connections and throws away anonymous traffic. Like antivirus software, these systems come with a price. In addition to typically costing more money, they cost time and performance resources inside the machine, especially if a system must evaluate all incoming traffic on a large network in real time. While you heard earlier about a 0 day that goes after a newly found vulnerability, most attacks attempt to exploit the vulnerabilities that the vendor has already discovered and attempted to ameliorate via a code update or software patch. The presence of a patch indicates that the vendor has found a vulnerability, identified a threat mitigation, and perhaps, most importantly, built a fix into the existing code. The problem is that many users don't always pay attention to these security updates and leave the vulnerabilities unpatched. This is why we have seen an evolution from the makers sending out simple notifications of new updates, which puts the burden of action on the user's part, to automatic downloads and even installation of the patch. But other costs have come along with this shift. Modern software is very complex, and fixing one small vulnerability could affect countless other processes in the program. Horror stories describe patches turning brand new smartphones into rather snazzy paperweights, or breaking entire enterprise networks. Since every large organization runs different software and has different configurations, patch management is an important part of any IT support. Just as your body's defenses aren't just skin level, serious threats are countered not only by keeping them out. There are measures to protect what's valuable even if threats get in. In the case of cyber espionage, for example, if you cannot prevent attackers from accessing the data, you can limit their ability to understand the data through encryption. The last line of defense is akin to the strategy that nuns use to police Catholic school dances. The nuns often stuff balloons between teenagers dancing too closely, creating an air gap to ensure nothing sneaky happens. In cybersecurity terms, an air gap is a physical separation between the network and critical systems. Such practice is common with critical infrastructure, such as with power companies, and was even attempted by the Iranians to protect their nuclear research from cyber attack. The problem with air gaps, much like the abstinence that the nuns try to enforce, is that it often doesn't work in practice. Giving up control of operational infrastructure involves sacrifices in efficiency and effectiveness. Power companies that don't link up, for instance, may be less vulnerable, but they can't run smart power grids that save both money and the environment. Similarly, maintaining an air gap is often unrealistic, as the Iranians discovered when their supposedly air-gapped systems still got infected by the Stuxnet virus. At some point, old data needs to come out, and new instructions need to go in. Systems need to be patched, updated, and maintained. Indeed, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center has conducted literally hundreds of vulnerability assessments of private American business air-gapping attempts. Not once did it find an operations network successfully separated from the firm's other computer enterprise networks. Finally, some advocate the old slogan that the best defense is a good offense. In the cyber world, this is known as hackback, and a number of firms have emerged to go after the attacker's own computer networks. Like vigilantism, it both feels good and may teach the original attacker a lesson. But the hackback business has two major problems. The first is that the question of who has the right to carry out cyber attacks is unclear, which means that cyber blackwater firms are skating on thin ice legally, says Nate Fick, CEO of the cybersecurity firm Endgame. The second is that it's not yet clear that hackback is even that effective over the long term. Alex Harvey, a security strategist for Fortinet, explains that breaking in and shutting them down isn't hard, but a new one will just pop up. You'll get a couple of minutes of peace and quiet. The bottom line in cyber defense is that it is a hard task, with various options that are far from perfect. But the only other option is to close the zoo and let the malware animals run free. Who is the weakest link? Human factors. In 2008, a U.S. soldier was walking through a parking lot outside of a U.S. military base in the Middle East when he spotted an unwrapped candy bar lying on the ground. Without knowing who had left it or how long the candy had been on the ground, he decided to take the bar inside the base and eat it for lunch. Sounds absurd, and even a bit disgusting, right? Well, substitute a USB flash drive for that candy bar, and you have the story of what started Buckshot Yankee, one of the largest cyber breaches in U.S. military history. In 2008, a foreign intelligence agency left flash drives in the parking lot outside a U.S. base, a tactic known as a candy drop. A soldier saw one of the drives in the dirt, picked it up, and thought it a good idea to plug the drive into a computer on the U.S. military's Central Command network. The drive uploaded a worm named Agent.btz that scanned computers for their data, created backdoors, and linked to command and control servers. The Pentagon spent the following 14 months cleaning the worm out, all because one soldier didn't have the common sense to apply the 5-second rule to how he treated his computer. The real battle in cybersecurity is not just about high technology. It is also driven by the human factor, the fight over our behavior. To use a metaphor from the wars of old, the walls protecting a network don't always have to be knocked down or tunneled under by an attacker. Sometimes, as in ancient Troy, oblivious defenders simply open up the gates without recognizing the attacker's deception. While there are varied advanced threats in cybersecurity, many of the most successful take advantage of good old-fashioned human error. Examples range from the executive at an IT company who found a malware-ridden CD in the men's bathroom and popped it into his computer to see what was on it. Again, think of the comparisons. Would you pick up a comb you found beside the urinal? Or a sandwich? To the employee at a defense company who used his business network to file share music. Besides sharing proprietary rock songs online, he also, unintentionally, shared designs for the electronics of the U.S. presidential helicopter with Iranian hackers. It is for this reason that many IT experts believe that if a network has any kind of sensitive information in it, all users need to be regularly certified in cybersecurity basics. This means everyone, from junior staff all the way up to the leadership. This is not just about enforcing the 5-second rule for things you plug into your computer. Clever attackers take advantage of our innate trust to convince us to click links, open attachments, or give out passwords to strangers over the phone. Since 99% of the time, our phone calls and emails are not malicious, it's hard to be constantly vigilant. Even experts can and will be fooled. Professor John Savage founded the Computer Science Department at Brown University in 1979 and has devoted much of his distinguished career to studying information security, including a stint advising the Department of State. Yet, while teaching a class on computer security, one of his students successfully tricked him into clicking a link in an email and entering his password. We subsequently hired that very enterprising student as a research assistant for this book. We'll go more into this in Part 3, but the goal is to recognize the key part that human behavior plays in enabling threats, and then build constant awareness, reinforcing it with new training. If users fail to learn the lessons of proper caution, then their access privileges should be revoked. Indeed, some companies like Lockheed Martin even have red team programs that every so often try to trick their own employees. If the employee opens a link in a suspicious email, for example, it links the offender to a refresher course on cybersecurity. Better we learn our lesson this way than download real malware, Trojan horses, or any other Greek-born cyber gifts. Part 2. Why it matters. What is the meaning of cyber attack? The importance of terms and frameworks. It had taken a long time to bring the two groups together, but finally, the senior American and Chinese officials were gathered around the same table. The important issues on the two great powers' agenda ranged from trade and finance matters to emerging cybersecurity concerns. But when the discussion finally started, the Chinese were baffled. The U.S. representatives spoke about the importance of the engagement. The Chinese translator wasn't sure whether the Americans were making a marriage proposal or discussing an exchange of fire, neither of which seemed appropriate for a meeting of diplomats. Trying to talk about a new issue can be a bit like traveling to a foreign land. New discussions require entire new vocabularies and frameworks just to understand what's happening. It can get even more complex in the realm of cyber issues, as the topics mix highly technical matters with broad concepts in which even the most basic terms can be loaded with meaning. For instance, when the United States and the USSR negotiated arms control treaties during the Cold War, they may have argued over things like the definition of a cruise missile, but there was no dispute as to whether the cruise missile was a weapon, nor that using a weapon like that against the other would be construed as an attack. The same cannot be said of the cyber realm, especially when it comes to what constitutes an attack in cyberspace. This term has been used to describe everything from online protests to the stealing of internet secrets to cyber sabotage of nuclear research to battlefield acts of war. And people fall prey to this confusion all the time. As we saw in Part 1 in 2011, a group of top U.S. senators talked about a $3 million case of credit card fraud at Citigroup and the Stuxnet worm, especially designed to cripple Iranian nuclear research, as if they were one and the same problem. Likewise, Chinese foreign ministry officials have talked about the spreading of rumors via social networks like Facebook as an attack in the same vein as hacking into power plants. Even experts in the field can fall prey to this problem or sometimes take advantage of others' confusion on the topic. In 2010, the lead U.S. general for the military's Cyber Command testified to Congress that every day America's armed forces face millions of cyber attacks. To get those numbers, though, he was combining everything from probes and address scans that never entered U.S. networks to actual data theft. But none of these attacks was what most of his listeners in Congress thought he meant by an attack. The feared digital Pearl Harbor or Cyber 9/11 that his boss, the Secretary of Defense, had been warning them about in a simultaneous series of speeches, testimony, and interviews with the mainstream media. Essentially, what people too often do when discussing cyber attacks is bundle together a variety of like and unlike activities simply because they involve Internet-related technology. The parallel would be treating the actions of a prankster with fireworks, a bank robber with a revolver, an insurgent with a roadside bomb, and a state military with a cruise missile, as if they were all the same phenomenon simply because Their tools all involved the same chemistry of gunpowder. When the U.S. government convened the National Research Council to study cyber attacks in 2009, it defined them as deliberate actions to alter, disrupt, deceive, degrade, or destroy computer systems or networks, or the information and or programs resident in or transiting these systems or networks. It's a good summary, but if you really want to know what a cyber attack is, you first have to distinguish it from traditional attacks. To begin with, cyber attacks employ different means. Instead of using kinetic force, a fist, a sword, a bomb, etc., they use digital means, a computer action of some sort. This is significant. A cyber attack is not constrained by the usual physics of traditional attacks. In cyberspace, an attack can literally move at the speed of light, unlimited by geography and the political boundaries. Being delinked from physics also means it can be in multiple places at the same time, meaning the same attack can hit multiple targets at once. The second way a cyber attack differs is in the target. Instead of causing direct physical damage, a cyber attack always first targets another computer and the information within it. The intended results of the attack may be to damage something physical, but that damage always first results from an incident in the digital realm. Stemming from these two fundamental differences are all the other ways that a cyber attack seems different from a physical attack. For instance, cyber attacks are often more difficult to attribute to a particular actor, at least compared to a clear smoking gun of a literally smoking gun. Of course, snipers sometimes shoot rifles specifically designed to thwart detection, while some cyber attackers sign their name into their malware to make sure they get credit for an attack. Similarly, the effect of a physical attack is usually, but not always, easier to predict. You can drop a laser-guided bomb through a window and project with near certainty the explosion's damage radius. With a computer virus, you can't always know whose computer it might end up on. Of course, there are exceptions. That bomb might also unintentionally collapse the building or explode a gas line that no one knew was inside, while in turn, some viruses like Stuxnet are specially designed only for a specific set of targets. Moreover, the costs to conduct a physical attack are likely in the purchase of actual weapons and their materials, while in cyber attacks the costs are more on the research and development side. That said, the experience of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb shows the exception to this rule. Bottom line, the only hard and fast difference between cyber attacks and other attacks is in their digital means and digital targets. But how, then, can we distinguish among cyber attacks themselves? As we've seen, they involve everything from denial of service, where the targeted system is simply flooded with too many requests from other networks, to Stuxnet, where the malware caused physical equipment in an Iranian nuclear lab to malfunction and spin out of control. It's like categorizing everything from a band of neighborhood kids ringing your doorbell and running away to the Norwegian resistance's sabotage of Nazi nuclear research in World War II. In Part 1, we discussed the classic CIA triad, the three fundamental goals that make up information security. They are 1. Confidentiality, 2. Integrity, and 3. Availability. Unsurprisingly, the best way to categorize attacks is by which of these three goals is being threatened. Let's take a closer look, then, at the CIA triad. Availability attacks are those that try to prevent access to a network, whether by overwhelming it with visits, a denial of service, or even taking it offline to shut down the physical or virtual processes that depend on it. As Dmitry Alperovich, a leading cybersecurity expert, notes, scale and impact are absolutely key in trying to weigh these attacks. A 1-hour denial of service attack on a video gaming website might seem a big deal to the gamers, but it isn't a strategic matter. By comparison, a prolonged denial of service attack that is not easily mitigated and which shuts down critical parts of the nation's infrastructure may very well be strategic and something we want to try to deter. Confidentiality attacks are efforts to gain entry into computer networks in order to monitor activities and extract information on the systems and on users' data. Weighing this kind of attack depends on both the information extracted and the scale of the effort. A criminal stealing your credit card and a spy agency stealing a jet fighter design are both conducting confidentiality attacks. But the consequences of financial fraud versus espionage are obviously different. As we explored the APTs, the real challenge occurs when these attacks extract information in a massive, organized way. Entities that have suffered such confidentiality attacks range from consumer goods companies that have seen their designs replicated without payment, to oil companies that have had their bidding strategy and drilling secrets taken, to aerospace companies that have seen designs of combat aircraft stolen. Over time, these can add up to a huge loss, which is why confidentiality attacks on intellectual property have become a strategic matter in U.S.-Chinese relations. Indeed, while the focus of U.S. debate is more frequently on fears of a so-called digital Pearl Harbor, the more serious problem may actually be a long-term economic death by 1,000 cuts. Finally, integrity attacks involve entering the system to change rather than extract information. They manipulate data in the virtual world as well as the systems and people who depend on that data in the real world. Most often, these attacks intend to either change the user's perception or situational awareness, or cause sabotage or subversion of physical devices and processes that are guided or operated by information systems. Such integrity attacks can be particularly insidious since we rely on computer systems to understand what's going on inside these same systems. Here, too, the goals and consequences of an integrity attack vary widely. The effect could be mere vandalism for political purposes, such as a defaced public-facing website of a government agency. An attack might be aiding or executing some sort of illegal endeavor, such as by changing access or identities to allow criminals through security barriers. Or it may seek to cause major harm of a strategic nature, such as damaging another country's ability to implement official decisions, to defend itself, or to provide services to its citizens via delivery of electric power, healthcare, etc. The data that is being changed, therefore, is what determines an integrity attack's importance. For instance, a hacker changing the software code for the White House website's welcoming picture of the president and a hacker changing the president's code for nuclear weapons commands are each conducting an integrity attack, but they will have vastly different results and call for vastly different responses. The difficult challenge is often not so much classifying these kinds of attacks as it is distinguishing them from each other, especially when they happen in real time. A confidentiality attack and an integrity attack both exploit vulnerabilities to gain entry to a system. They can use the same approaches and technical specs to get inside, but it's what the attackers do once there that makes the difference. Do they observe and steal data, change data, or add new data, depositing what is known in weapons terms as a payload? Often the victim won't be able to tell until the act plays out. To continue with our White House example, when the Secret Service notices a man sneaking over the fence, they don't wait to see whether he wants to peek at papers on the president's desk or plant a bomb there. The difference in the cyber realm, however, is that such a drama can play out in a matter of nanoseconds. To go back to our original engagement problem, defining these terms is only the start. Next is crossing the huge gulf between how different nations conceive them. Take the notion of information, which is the target of all these types of attacks, whether the intent is to disrupt, steal, or change it. But information and its flow across the Internet can be interpreted in vastly different ways. The provision of online news and connections across geographic borders via social networking tools has been described by American leaders as an essential human right. By contrast, the very same free flow has been described by leaders in Russia and China not as a human right, but as an information attack designed to undermine state stability. As a result, in international exchanges, U.S. officials have talked about cyber attacks in terms of assaults on and intrusions of cyber systems and critical infrastructure, while their counterparts, from places like Russia, have discussed them as part of a Western information war to undermine regimes in the name of democratic reform. Figuring all this out is going to take a very long engagement, indeed. Whodunit? The problem of attribution. The name came from either a mashup of the domain name trafficconverter.biz or a play on the German swear word for fucker. In either case, Conficker, that's spelled C-O-N-F-I-C-K-E-R, wasn't so much innovative as it was nasty, combining several types of malware to enter into unprotected computers, hide under a random file name in the root directory, and use the compromised computer to connect out and build a botnet. It first surfaced in late 2008 when a vulnerability was discovered in Microsoft Windows programs. The company rushed to release a patch to the public, but as many as 30% of users did not apply the protection. Soon after, security experts in different parts of the IT industry detected the first moves of what became known as Conficker, a computer worm. Within a few months of Conficker's appearance, some 7 million computers had been compromised into one of the biggest botnets in the world. Computers and networks ranging from the French Navy to Southwest Airlines were all pulled into what one security expert called the holy grail of a botnet. Spooked by its scale, a diverse group of investigators representing security firms, consumer software companies, ISPs, and universities assembled to battle Conficker. Still, no one could figure out the worm's exact purpose or origin. Someone was building a massive botnet, but who was doing it, and why? Then, the team found a tantalizing hint. An early version of the malware checked the targeted computer's keyboard layout. If it was set to the Ukrainian language, the attack aborted. But what did this mean? Was it a sign that it was authored in Ukraine, not Russia or China, as some had originally thought? And the authors wanted to avoid infecting their compatriots and avoid committing a crime in their own local jurisdiction? Or was it a clever bit of misdirection, designed to make it seem like whoever designed it was Ukrainian? Years later, the who and why of Conficker still remain a mystery. As this episode illustrates, beyond the issue of terminology, there are other dimensions that make the cyber arena so challenging to secure, and therefore need to be explored further. Perhaps the most difficult problem is that of attribution. Many forms of malware take control of the victim's computers and form a botnet that links unrelated computers and enables the controller to leverage their combined computing and communications capabilities. The resulting network of secretly linked devices can easily grow to extraordinary dimensions. For example, in 2010, 3 not-so-terribly sophisticated Spaniards created a global botnet that included over 12 million computers using a program they bought on the black market. In other cases, a controller may seek to capture and leverage only a small number of computers. Controllers use this tactic when concealing their identity is a priority. 3 key features of this capability to capture and utilize other computers are particularly important. First, there are no geographical limits. For example, someone in Brazil can compromise computers in South Africa to launch attacks on systems in China, which might be controlled by computers physically located in the United States. Second, the owner of a captured computer often has no idea that it is being used by a remote actor for pernicious purposes. Of the computers that attacked Estonia in the cyber incidents of 2007, 25% were U.S.-based, even though the attack was originally Russian-sourced, as we describe later. And third, when some pernicious activity is perpetuated, sophisticated analysis can typically, at best, identify the computer being used to launch the attack. It is far more difficult to determine whether that computer is being operated remotely, and if so, by whom. Even if a computer is not being remotely accessed, In many situations, such as with a computer at a university or an internet cafe, it is difficult to determine the identity of those sitting behind the computer, their nationality, or what organization they represent. Such information would be crucial in a crisis, but is rarely available in a timely manner, and attempts to gather it raise huge privacy concerns. It doesn't take much imagination to see how damaging these problems can be. Take how cybersecurity concerns have increasingly poisoned U.S.-Chinese relations, which we personally witnessed as part of exchanges with U.S. and Chinese cyber experts and officials. Since many in the United States assume that the Chinese government has significant control over its citizens, it's easy to assume that the government is behind most insidious activities launched by computers located within China. But, of course, this also means that bad actors elsewhere may be incentivized to target Chinese computers for capture and use in their activities to misdirect suspicions. This very same logic, though, also enables Chinese actors to deny responsibility. They consistently argue that activities actually launched from China are being perpetrated by others who want to take advantage of the widespread suspicions of China, pointing to the large number of vulnerable, unpatched computers in their country. And the same type of misdirection can be carried out using computers physically located inside the United States. Essentially, you get a lot of finger-pointing and not much certainty. The issue is that establishing attribution is not the same as establishing complicity. It's sometimes possible to track an actor's efforts to a certain geographic locale, but it is more difficult to establish any formal government role, whether as perpetrator or sanctioner of the operation. As we explore later, patriotic hacker communities and other non-state groups, including student and even cyber-criminal groups, have been mobilized by their governments for such purposes. They offer deniable but directed attack. Ronald Dybert is a leading Canadian expert who has tracked various cyber espionage networks like GhostNet, which stole information from over 1,200 computers in 103 countries. He explains, attacks can be crowdsourced by governments, or arise from acts of spontaneous participation, or both. In such an environment, it complicates the task of assigning blame to a state and forming an appropriate response. This is potentially destabilizing the global order. Attribution is further complicated by the fact that in some kinds of attacks, it is difficult to initially determine if what is going on is hostile. A shift in routing information at an internet access point, for example, might be a normal update, or it could be a malicious attempt to reroute internet traffic. A stream of unusual traffic that hits a system's firewall could just be a misconfigured application somewhere in the world, or it could be a probe of defenses. Packets are not like ICBMs, where radar can quickly detect the missile for what it is. On top of this, once malware enters a system, it does not always bear any telltale sign of its origin or intent. Unlike bullets or even atomic bombs, each nuclear reactor has a distinctive signature to which a bomb's fissionable material can typically be traced. When malware is uncovered, it often does not point to a particular culprit.